the sequence of Unicode characters into a representation that utilizes only alphanumeric characters and hyphens. For example, the domain re-muxxed, I hope I pronounced that right, is encoded with the following Unicode sequence, as you can see there. Due to the very nature of how Unicode works, it makes it difficult to test because changing one character can affect the entire output and the character position due to how the algorithm works. So what we want to do is generate some malicious characters that when it's decoded, what we want to do is generate malicious characters when it's decoded, but doing so is a big challenge. In these examples, you can see the Unicode character changes when one byte is modified. This makes it difficult to generate a malicious payload. So after reading about Unicode on Wikipedia, I followed a link to an online Unicode converter and I began to experiment. The converter used the IDN PHP library. I first started to add zeros to the beginning of the Unicode address to convert it into ASCII characters. So I initially succeeded generating a comma, which was so surprising I doubted my eyes. Encouraged by this, I started to experiment further and managed to produce an @ symbol. So after searching GitHub, I found an interesting target using the library, Joomla. This was great because if I got XSS, then I would have RCE. Doing a source code analysis, I noticed they were escaping the email before it was Unicode decoded. This means if I could produce some malformed Unicode that when decoded produces HTML, I could get XSS, but it wouldn't be that easy. Sounds simple, just give the decoder some malformed Unicode and generate some HTML. But remember how the algorithm works. Any change in the character can result in a completely different output. I thought about this for a while, and I thought that this was a good job for a fuzzer. So I wrote a fuzzer to generate malformed Unicode, and the results were interesting. I found many ways to generate different characters. So you can see what I was trying to do here. I'm trying to generate an SVG tag. So I started generating millions of different character combinations. I managed to construct partial XSS vectors, but I encountered several issues. I could only generate 2 ASCII characters by using more than one Unicode subdomain. This limitation arose from the specific workings of the Unicode algorithm, PHP, and the quirks of this buggy PHP IDN library. As you can see in the examples, I was really close, but these problems made exploiting Joomla very difficult. I concluded that XSS was not feasible, because although I was able to generate a single quoted attribute, it required an underscore character, and Joomla, however, does not permit underscore characters in the domain part of the email address. So you can see those mad Unicode addresses are trying to inject some HTML. So was that the end of the story? Not quite. I thought about this for a while, and I worked out that you could use a single Unicode subdomain, and you could generate any opening tag. Eventually, after a lot of testing, I concluded the only exploitable vector was an opening style tag. Here I use malformed Unicode to construct it. It looks like a test string, right? But this is actually how it works. Style 123 and 321, sorry, and that would generate a style tag. The rest of the pre-existing Joomla HTML code would add the space and the closing angle bracket for me. So it injects this style tag, and then the rest of the HTML adds those characters for me. So what I'd need is 2 accounts. The first registers with a style tag with malformed Unicode as demonstrated. The second account has the actual CSS payload inside the name of the user. That imports the malicious style sheet. The first account starts with A and the second account starts with X. This is to ensure the style injection occurs first and then the payload with the import occurs second. Notice I'm using curly braces. This is to treat all the HTML that occurs before the import as an invalid CSS selector. And this still works because this is CSS, right? It'll just work. So the first step is to register 2 accounts for the attacker. The first with the malicious Unicode and the second with the evil CSS. So here we're using the malformed Unicode in the email and the second account in the name. The attacker then uses import chaining and a custom node server, a custom CSS exfiltrator, to quickly exfiltrate the CSRF token from the admin. And when the admin visits the user's page, this CSS will get executed and the CSRF token is leaked to the attacker. The screenshot shows this process happening. Using the exfiltrated token, the attacker then uses the CSS exfiltrator and gives the admin a URL. The admin visits that site and a CSRF attack is then performed on the admin using the exfiltrated token, and then the admin template is then modified and then you get RCE. Now, James said I should do a live demo. I wasn't as keen, but let's give it a shot. Right, so on the left is the victim, so it's the admin on the left. On the right is the attacker. We've also got the exfiltrator running, and this is where the token will be extracted. So the attacker visits the page. I've pre-filled the data because we don't want to see me typing everything. And the email address contains a malformed Unicode. So I get an error, and that error is just because I haven't configured mail on the server. And then you register a second account, and this is with the actual payload in that exfiltrates the token. So the 2 accounts are registered. Now let's log in as the admin and pray to the demo gods. Woohoo! Right. Thank you very much. But we still need to send the message to the admin, right? Hey admin, how's your day going? Yeah, going good, living the dream. Let's click on this. So I'm showing you a real attack. You wouldn't show the payload in there, but we've backdoored Joomla, and then the attacker goes to pwned, and we've got ICE with casting, etc. password. Thank you. Thank you. So whilst conducting this research, I found it useful to follow the following methodology: probe, observe, encode, exploit. First, probe for encoded word, observe that it will be decoded to confirm that it's supported, then encode the various characters and observe how they're decoded, and then follow with an exploit that abuses these characters. So this methodology is spelled out here. So these are the steps you can take to exploit, and this is some of the steps I use to exploit these targets. HackVerter is a free open source tool that I wrote for Burp Suite. I've crafted some HackVerter tags to help you generate Unicode overflows and encoded word attacks easily within Burp. Turbo Intruder is another free Burp extension written by James Kettle. I've created a Turbo Intruder script to exploit the mailer. So you remember when GitHub supported null, for example, this was found with Turbo Intruder. I've also created a Punicode fuzzer to help with malformed Punicode. The fuzzer works by giving some inputs, some Punicode address, and then the placeholders are substituted with random numbers, characters, or whitespace. It was really effective in finding what characters could be generated. We've also updated Burp Intruder word list with a list of these attacks too, for your convenience. To defend against email splitting attacks, make sure you filter out or disable encoded word. Always verify email addresses before using them, even when received from an SSO provider. After validating the email address, do not use the domain as a sole means of authorization, because it can lead to bad stuff. A few blog posts were really inspirational when conducting this research. I recommend you read each one because they are really useful and contain really useful information. The import chaining technique to use to exfiltrate the token is from Pet Villa and Donut, awesome researchers. So the three takeaways that I want to leave you with are: valid email addresses that can trigger major parser discrepancies. Even email addresses that end in @example.com might go elsewhere, and as a result, it's never safe to use email domains for access control enforcement. We've created a Web Security Academy CTF so you can try and do an email splitting attack. I've also created a Docker file with the vulnerable Joomla installation for your convenience. You can get all the materials and download all the materials for this presentation are on the GitHub repository. Thank you very much, DEF CON. Thank you. Any questions?
How's everyone doing? I'm genuinely surprised. So either y'all went to bed early or you never went to bed. So thank you so much for being here. This talk is maladaptive, diving really, really deep into LDAP obfuscation, deobfuscation, and detection. My name is Daniel Bohannon. Everyone I know calls me Debo for short, so feel free to call me that. I'm a principal threat researcher for a startup company called Permiso Security, doing cloud and identity stuff. For the last better part of a decade, I've been really focused on endpoint security, doing some IR and threat research at Mandiant, Microsoft, and I have a little bit of a problem with obfuscation. It's kind of an obsession of mine of taking things that look normal and making them look just absolutely crazy. And then as a defender, looking for ways to detect those things. Another thing I'm really passionate about is coffee and books and all the great conversations that happen around both of those things.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Sabayeta. You can call me Sabi for short. I'm originally from Albania. I recently moved to Germany, Berlin, working for Solaris as a senior cybersecurity engineer. I'm passionate about cyber defense. Currently, I'm also working on the field, doing a little incident response, detection engineering, and time when time allows, threat hunting. I do have also some experience in consulting and government. Love mountains. You can see even the gold there. And enjoy movies a lot at the engineer. I'm passionate about cyber defense. Currently, I'm also working on the field, doing a little incident response, detection engineering, and time when time allows, threat hunting. I do have also some experience in consulting and government.
Create problems. We want to actually have solutions there so that defenders can walk away equipped with something really beneficial, and then we'll do a demo and a tool release at the end. So let's get going. We are going to go back in time to the days of disco balls and DeLoreans, talk about the 1980s. The directory access protocol, or the DAP, was a directory service kind of at that time. LDAP is the lightweight version. That's the L in LDAP. Between 93 and 97, you have 3 different versions of LDAP come onto the scene. 1998, the Open LDAP project released Open LDAP, and then what's important for this presentation is in the year 2000, Microsoft released Active Directory, in which they kind of ensure compliance with LDAP. So it's important to remember there's a server and client-side component here. Active Directory, we chose that because it's the most popular, most widely used application service, or directory service application in use, and so we want to make sure all the rules of obfuscation that we were discovering and building would work against an Active Directory server. So that's the server-side component. You have clients that will issue LDAP queries, or LDAP what are called search filters, and then LDAP is literally the protocol that allows that exchange of information between the client side and the server side. On the offensive side, LDAP, or AD in general, is quite a popular topic. And you look at open source tooling in the last decade, you have things like PowerView from the folks at Spectre Ops, Bloodhound, Sharphound, Soaphound, any kind of hound, right? Looking for really quick ways to get information from an offensive perspective, but also for defensive perspectives. With Bloodhound and Ping Castle, looking for ways to give defenders quick visibility into attack paths so that they can make better choices and increase the complexity for attackers to come and get a really short path to DA or whatever else they want. So as defenders, we should then ask, okay, if attackers are using this, what are our data sources for defending? And so this is actually kind of a point of frustration for us. When we started this research, even to the day, there's not that many options for production-ready telemetry gathering for LDAP. What we use in our by Ruben Boonin, and actually one of the modules that were released with maladaptive is a telemetry module to allow you to install these things, configure them, so you can have locally that client-side visibility. And then on the server side, there are options like kind of like debug mode options, but those are not generally recommended to turn on in production. So if you want this visibility in production, the best case right now is get Microsoft Windows Defender. CrowdStrike has some stuff I've heard as well, but in terms of like, if you want to just trust the detections they have, cool. If you want to have all the data so you can validate, then maybe explore your options a little bit. So another thing to keep in mind is there are big differences between client-side and server-side logs when it comes to LDAP. For all the hackers in the room, you're going to love client-side logs because it's basically like WYSIWYG. Like any obfuscation we're going to talk about, you put that in, that's exactly what it looks like in those client-side logs. Awesome for obfuscation evasion. With an important caveat, it depends how you're issuing that query. So a lot of the mechanisms, like the ADZ accelerator in PowerShell, will use the WLDAP32.dll to route that request. If that's the case, then the data will show up in an ETW stream for the LDAP provider, and you can scoop it out. However, some folks have noticed there are many other ways to talk to an Active Directory server. SoapHound is an example from Falcon Force. They said, hey, let's just make SOAP requests directly to the domain controller and avoid any kind of client-side logging. So because of this, it's still a valuable data source, but it's important to look at the server-side logs as well. There's significant normalization that occurs in server-side logs. So a lot of the obfuscation we'll talk about is normalized, but there are still some interesting tricks that do persist. And yeah, that's all I'll say about that right now. So over the next 40-ish minutes, we're going to be doing an absolute speed run through all of the obfuscation that we've enumerated and built out in this for this research. This is something we spent over 2,000 hours of R&D on. For the record, that's too much R&D. Don't recommend it to anybody. But here we are, so we're really happy to get this out there and then let our minds think about something else. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing a demo and tool release for maladaptive. And the name comes from maladaptive because typically people think of LDAP queries as like a pretty simple, rigid kind of a language. So how flexible can it really be? And we hope to convince you pretty quickly that it can be pretty flexible. So with that, let's look at the LDAP overview so we know which pieces of an LDAP search request we're talking about for each obfuscation technique.
So we're going to let's dive deep into the anatomy of an LDAP search request. We'll be looking at RFC 4511. There are many components to an LDAP search request, but we're going to be focused on the four main ones, which is the base object, where in the Active Directory structure to start the search, the scope that says how far to let the search run, the filter, which is the logic of what to look for in the directory structure, and the attribute selection, which are the properties that we want to bring back. As defenders, most people focus on the filter for detecting malicious LDAP queries. So for this reason, it's also going to be our primary obfuscation focus. We don't want to overlook also the base object and attribute selection, so they're going to be our secondary and tertiary obfuscation focus. As filter is the main one, let's see what makes up a filter. So well, it's made up of tokens. There are 5 required tokens that we have group start and group end. They hold in the middle the attribute and the value for it, and the comparison operator. So here, for example, I'm looking for myself, basically. There are also 2 optional tokens, which is Boolean operator and extensible match filter. Debo is going to talk about these in the upcoming slides, but just so you know, these are bitwise values. They have different meanings based on the attributes, and Microsoft documents all of these per attribute. So different numbers mean actually different things to different attributes. In this one, basically, we're looking for objects that are not disabled, let's say. Most people actually do not write simple filters like this. They do try to combine multiple filters, and they do that with a Boolean operator to create a filter list. So it's not going to look actually as a pretty tree just like this one, but as a single row, usually. So it's going to be composed of 2 filters, which together they make up a filter list, and the whole string is actually called a search filter for an LDAP search request. Uh-oh.
Sorry. No, we don't need help with PowerPoint transitions.
Moving on.
Hold on. It looks like you could use some help with crowd work. Hilarious. Oh, Clippy. I have trivia and jokes. I don't know. I could use that on a Sunday morning. How about y'all? What do you call the biggest LDAP search request in history? Any takers? It's pronounced 10.5 megabytes, because that's the limit for a search request. Now, Clippy actually comes armed with sources, but just know that that's a lot of data. Keep in mind, LDAP is not just for querying information, it's also for updating records. But for the purpose of recon, I encourage anybody in this room something even close to 10.5 megs and see how much shows up in your logs. All right. Thanks, Avi. So now that we have a good idea of the different components of LDAP that we're going to be looking at, let's actually do the fun stuff of obfuscation. For all the defenders in the room, it's going to get dark and bleak before it gets bright again, but we promise there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So as Sabi mentioned, the filter is going to be the primary obfuscation focus because it really is kind of the primary defensive detection focus today. And we're going to spend most of our time on the filter, and then a lot of the techniques that work on the filter will then be applied to the base object and attribute selection as well. There's a lot of things that we discovered that are not documented. Some of it was sheer luck, some of it was brute forcing, some of it was the fact that when you build an obfuscation framework, you're kind of defining the boundaries of the language, and it's going to break out sometimes and teach you things that still work. And so we'll try to mention things that are undocumented and also put this undocumented icon at the top. So we're going to start by looking at these 5 tokens and looking at obfuscation that can be applied to each, beginning with the attribute token.
So let's see what we can do to obfuscate the attribute. We can actually do casing. It is case sensitive, so we can play with it. We can use OID object identifier. OID object identifier, Microsoft defines it as a dotted string of numbers, which is actually quite true because you can also add this OID prefix at the beginning of it, and it's still going to work, which is also case sensitive. Another thing that is really fascinating and undocumented is that we can add prefixes of zeros to each octet on this part, and it executes just fine. It will also show just like this, also on client-side logs. Another thing we can do for attribute obfuscation is ambiguous name resolution. So the same applies as above. So we can use insensitive casing and OID notation even for the ANR. But what is exactly ANR? So in case you know some name, but you don't know in which property it actually is, you can search, and what it will actually do, depending on the version of Active Directory, it will logically transform this single term into this query. So basically everything is ended in a wildcard, except for some attributes that do not support this. And in case your search actually contains a space, just like us, we are looking for domain admins, then it's going to be added this one, so these 4 ones, because it will treat it as a first name, last name, first name. Some nice obfuscation tricks. So we can use ANR, for example, if we're trying to search for curb TGT, and we can also use, which is the second example, only some parts of it, and it's going to be an explicit wildcard. So we'll still, even on the second example, we're still going to have the same results. And the third example, which is very nice, we actually discovered that if you add an implicit wildcard, after that, everything you add is going to be ignored. So you can play with it, but you're still going to get the result of ANR and return the curb TGT. And just as this is also going to be handled from our detection framework. If you don't want to do all the crazy stuff with the wildcard and just be explicit, you can actually just add an equal sign, which is the documented way to get the information. As a recap, for attribute obfuscation, we can do casing, object identifier notation, and ambiguous name resolution. Clippy again. Do you know where else ambiguous name resolution exists? We don't know, Clippy. Where? Microsoft. What is more ambiguous than resolving to rename your products every 6 months? Am I right?
I did not know Clippy was allowed to make Microsoft burns. I don't know if that was cleared. Thanks, Clippy. So one token down. We've talked about attributes. Next, we're going to look at the comparison operator. Most of the time, this is an equal sign. When it comes to Active Directory's implementation of LDAP, you also have the approximately equal to, because casing doesn't matter, but it does prevent you from using the wildcard and hex characters that we'll be talking a lot more about later. But we're really going to focus on the range operator. So greater than equal to, less than equal to. So here's an example a lot of red teamers will be familiar with. Service principal name equals star means give us the objects that have an SPN. Any value, I don't care, but it must be defined. Well, technically, we could rewrite this with a string operator and say, hey, make sure it's present. It has a value that is greater than equal to the alphabetical sorting of a string that begins with equals or the exclamation point or is less than ZZZ. So there are other ways logically that you can accomplish this equivalence, this presence filter. One really important note: if you think about the printable range of ASCII characters, this is the proper ordering that we all know and love and have agreed upon as a standard of the industry. We do not know why, but there is an abnormal range or sorting for strings in Active Directory. Casing doesn't matter, so we get rid of those. But you have all the digits and alpha characters at the end. You have this very specific grouping of special characters, and all the other characters fall right into the middle. This took us probably 5 days to find because this bug only occurred like 1 out of 1,000 iterations. But this is the ordering. So our obfuscation framework handles that, but just know it's kind of weird. Another thing we can do is use the range filters for precise values. So SAM account type equals this number ending with 368. This is another bitwise value, but let's say that detections were looking at this. Well, you could also, instead of saying ends with 368, say greater than equals to 7, less than equal to 9, and then specifically exclude the 7 and 9, so logically you're left with an 8. If you're like me and a more visual person, I like to think of it as a timeline. And so greater than equals 7, less than equal to 9, and then let's just pop off the 7 and 9, so you're left with the 8. There are a lot of kind of flavors or recipes we built into the obfuscation module, showing a couple of them here. One of my favorites is actually using ranges for exclusions. In this last example, where you can say, give me the presence filter, but then exclude everything outward and inclusive of the numbers 7 and 9, so you're left with 8. So again, those are all random options in the obfuscation filter, the obfuscation module. This works for numbers. It also works for strings with the caveat that suffixes are a little tricky, but yeah, it is still quite effective for those things. So interview for the second token type, comparison operator, we have approximately equal to, we have the logical equivalence for the presence filter, and then we can use the range operators to do some really fun stuff for precise values, whether they're strings or numbers. And defenders should be pretty familiar with some of these we just looked at because it's actually part of the Sharphound project. So that SAM account type, service principal name. So again, these are pretty relevant examples, and you can see that if a detection was looking for this, it would probably get smoked by what we just showed you. So the third token type is the Boolean operator. Mostly we think of ands and ors, but when it comes to LDAP, the not is where things get really crazy, really fast. So let's take a really practical example. Let's say you're looking for country equals Albania. You want to have all those objects that come out of Active Directory. One thing you can do is just throw a bunch of Boolean operators inside of it, and logically it doesn't matter if you and or one thing, it's still going to be that same one thing. Additionally, you can also put in double negation. Again, logically this is still going to give you country equals Albania, the same number of objects. Additionally, if you want to do a Boolean operator, you can technically slide it right inside of the filter itself. So in this case, we're looking for location equals Kukus, which is a city inside of Albania. You can see that bottom example that Boolean is sitting directly inside of the group start, group end filters or tokens. In our parser that we wrote for this research, we handle this similarly, but do call it the distinction because it is extremely important for certain kinds of detections as well as obfuscation of the obfuscation scenarios. Most of the time, though, you're dealing with a slightly more complex filter like this. So this is saying, I want to know when the country is Albania, and either the location is Kukus or Tirana, 2 cities. It's important to know that the Boolean operator has kind of a scope of influence. So in this case, there are 2 Booleans, and you can see the boxes around the filters that they affect. If we added in a third set, there are now 3 groups. And so as we're parsing it, we basically create a stack of Boolean operators to know exactly how many Booleans are affecting the filter that we're looking at. One really, really fun feature is the not Boolean operator. So let's slide that in there. The not only affects the first filter or the first Boolean operator that it modifies. So we can see location equals Kukus is modified by that not, but the filter just below it is completely, it doesn't modify it at all. So this is another one that we have to track, as well as a lot of crazy things like negation, traversal, because you can have lots of layers in between and you have to track the bools all the way. Lots of fun, honestly a lot of headaches, but yeah, it's built into the parser so we don't have to think about that anymore. And we'll see that in the demos towards the end. My personal favorite obfuscation technique with Boolean operators is logical inversion. So for any math nerds in the house, this is known as de Morgan's law, but basically not A or B is the same as not A and not B with the inverse sitting below. So what you can do is take any LDAP search filter, choose a spot and negate it. In this case, we're going to choose the whole filter, and now everything else kind of to the right of that is going to be in scope for obfuscation. So step number 2 is identifying within that in scope section all the ands and ors and inverting them. And then the third step is locating all the filters and inverting them from a negation perspective. So none of these filters are negated, so we're going to add that not, and those are now negated. Now, this is logically the same as what we started with. Again, this is a lot of headaches if you're parsing this manually. And so in the parser, we basically have a concept of what's the logical inclusion. Is this included true or false? What's the logical Boolean? Is it and or? And we also maintain a stack of all those Boolean operator tokens for your convenience. So interview for the third token type of Boolean operator, we have the additive nature, double negation, and then de Morgan's laws for the Boolean operator inversion. Oh goodness, okay. What is my least favorite LDAP token type? I'm assuming Boolean operator, but let's see what happens here. Yep, Boolean operator because I'm afraid of getting tied up in knots. Oh, that's cringe, Clippy. Clippy's losing steam fast. Get that out of the way, okay. All right, the fourth token type, extensible match filter. So Savi mentioned this before. This is for attributes that have bitwise values. It's an integer number, but it actually represents base 2 add-ins for all the bitwise flags based on which attribute that it is. There are 4 values that are supported by Active Directory's LDAP implementation. We're going to focus on the first 2 because they're the most interesting in terms of obfuscation. That's the and the or. For me, I remember the or because it ends with .804. So 804 is or, 803 is not or. All right, so here's an example. User account control, and you can see in the red is the extensible match filter. In this case, it's an 803, so that's an and it's the number 515, which is the base 2 add-ins 1, 2, and 512. So one of the things we can do is what we call bitwise breakout. So we can break that 515 out into 1 and 514. Again, as long as we have the proper grouping of add-ins, we can do this. 514 is actually 2 and 512, so we can break it out even further. So from a detection perspective, we can spread our logic across many different filters, which is really, really complicated, but it's also fun. If you started with an or, the same trick applies. Just make sure that the Boolean operator you add is an or instead of an and that matches the extensible match filter. This is a pretty trivial example, but a lot of real-world examples can get pretty crazy. Like this is get domain user from PowerView. Massive number. You can imagine all the random groupings and regroupings of base 2 add-ins to produce the same value in your overall search filter. So another thing we can do is if you have a filter that is a precise value, so this is looking for the exact 1s and 0s set to equal this number, what you can do is use this little formula. You can add the extensible match filter and for all the 1 bits, you can add the or extensible match filter for all the 0 bits and negate it, and then both of those filters together. What's really cool about this is now we have extensible match filters and we can use the first breakout type to break those into smaller and smaller random groupings of those base 2 add-ins. So we're not going to take this further, but this could explode into 10, 15, 20 different filters all slammed together. So interview for the fourth token type of extensible match filter, we have the bitwise breakout with and or, and also the precise breakout, which kind of combines the second one with the first one.
Thanks, Thibaut. Let's look at what we can do to obfuscate a little the value. We're still in the filter section. So excluding a couple of attribute types, just like seen here, it is still casing doesn't matter, so it's case sensitive. And we can also do prepended zeros to anything that are bitwise digits or numbers. And we got some undocumented feature regarding timestamps is that we originally noticed that sometimes milliseconds were present, but it didn't actually seem to matter. If you change the milliseconds values or remove them, it turns out you can actually add literally anything as long as you have a capital Z in it. So, and technically, it is going to be treated still as a correct timestamp in the results. And it doesn't need to be only capital Z. It can also be its hex encoding representation, which leads us to the next point, which is hex encoding for value obfuscation. And it's our favorite thing to do, to be honest. The hex encoding itself, it exists to be able to escape certain special characters, which Microsoft has detailed here very well, but you can also escape any printable characters that you want to as well. So you can swap these with the hex representations, and it's still going to give you the same results, and it's going to show just like this on the client-side logs. Again, our parser parses, decodes all the values, so it's all being handled. One undocumented thing is that Microsoft says that the hex representation should be followed by 2 characters, representative ASCII hex character, but that's actually not true for the first 16 characters. You can drop the leading 0, and it's still going to work. Wildcards. We mentioned a little bit even the wildcards. So for example, instead of looking for the curved TGT, you can also just look for RBG and see what you get. These, actually for wildcards, we are not the only ones who have been looking for evasion purposes. So even the researcher Hope Walker, these are 2 great blog post returns. It's a researcher at SpectreOps, and she outlines using wildcards for evasion purposes. As a recap, for value, we can do casing, we can do prepended zeros, timestamps, hex encoding, and wildcards. The good news is that's all you can do with obfuscation. Nah, I'm lying, you guys. We got much more. So until now, we actually were looking for token obfuscation. Let's see outside of it a little. And for example, for filter-wide obfuscation, you can also actually add group start and group end as much as you want, as long as you stay until the depth of 99. You can also add white space all over, and it's insignificant, and it can be new line, tab, etc. Garbage filters, again. Here, actually, you need to be careful if you're actually using logical or logical AND, because in case you're looking for logical AND, you need to make sure the properties exist. But you can go crazy with ORs. And lastly is filter reordering. So until now, we only handled the filter. Let's see what we can do with base object. As a reminder, the base object is where in the Active Directory structure we want to start the search. There are some good detection opportunities that we feel aren't discussed as much. And for example, like some passive tools, just like Certify, they have a very benign, common, and super common search filter. So in this case, is the base object, and it's looking for public key services. We are going to focus from a syntax perspective on a really simple object like this. All the tricks we've seen until now, okay, for example, they still work, which is the casing we can play. You can do also the hex encoding for the value portion. You can use the OID notation of the attribute, and also supports the OID prefix as well as the your prefixes. And white space, it actually can be added at the end, as well as between the slashes of the LDAP prefix. Something interesting is that it's true for the base object, but not for the value. In the filter is that as long as hex is not present, you can actually encapsulate it with double quotes, and it will show up this way in client-side logs, but it's not going to look like this on server-side logs. Lastly is the attribute selection. Basically, is which attributes properties do you want to be returned in the results. And here also, casing doesn't matter. You can substitute, just like previously. You can also use object identifier notation. Also supports adding OID prefix and prepended zeros. Add white space only after the attributes that are on the OID syntax. Not sure why, but yeah, a lot of trial and error, to be honest. We have the option also to add duplicate attributes and garbage attributes, literally anything you want. And the person who's going to answer about this is no one else than Clippy. Hey, Daniel, what do you call this character? Asterisk, wildcard, or splat?
I think this is an ages question, but all 3 are true, but there's a lot of space down there, so let's see what Clippy has to say. F, all the above. So 2 more important things here from an input perspective in the attribute selection. If the only value defined is a wildcard, it will return all the properties, even just the same as if you don't define any attribute selection. What's fascinating is that in server-side logs, that wildcard is going to literally be printed as the string square brackets, all, ALL, all lowercase. Now, you can notice E is that if you have a list of attributes and any one of those is a wildcard, then the server-side logs will translate that wildcard into this other string, all with list. If you are parsing these attribute selection values, you need to know that this weird string is prepended to the first attribute. So you have to do a really specific split and translation that we do in the logging module, but just know there's some weirdness that goes on there. Thanks, Clippy. All right, now that is actually the end of the obfuscation portion. So we talked about the search filter, we talked about the base object and attribute selection. So for all the defenders in the room, what now? So from a solution perspective, we're going to focus on 3 steps. 1 is parsing, 2 is enriching, and then 3 is the actual detection itself. So from a parsing perspective, when we started this research, there was no parser for LDAP search filters. And so we naively said, let's just build a parser. How hard could it be? To be honest, that was over half of the research, but it was one of the most interesting and fulfilling parts of this. And so we wrote a C# state machine parser to firstly do tokenization. So that means when you have a string come in, that's the entire search filter, let's break it into tokens. So we know which ones are attributes, values, comparison operator, etc. Next, you want to organize those tokens into a representation that allows you to understand the structure of nested Boolean operators and filters and filter lists and all those sorts of things. And then you can move on to actual enrichment, which is step number 2. So here's an example of using all the conversion modules within Maladaptive. To start with a string, break it into tokens, and then every step of the way, we try to decode and enrich however much we can. So as Sabi mentioned, when they're hex values, we'll automatically decode them for you. But we leave the original syntax as well. One distinction between, so in our parsing, we do tokenization, and then we basically create a parse tree or a syntax tree, which is almost an abstract syntax tree, but we drop the abstract part, because abstract says let's drop things that don't need to be there, like insignificant white space. Well, by definition, obfuscation doesn't need to be there, so we actually want to keep all those insignificant things, so we can recreate the input from that parse tree. And then after we break this into tokens and do those enrichments, we'll then group them into filters and branches and a tree structure to do certain kinds of obfuscation and detections that require that kind of tree grouping functionality as we go through and parse it. And then the final step is actually detect. So we try to make it as simple as possible. We wrap all this inside of a single function called find. find evil. So you can pipe any number of search filters you want in the find evil, and for each of those filters, it will parse it, do all the enrichment we just talked about. It will run it through all our complete detection rule set, which we are releasing with maladaptive, so 65 rules and counting. And then for each of those detections, the rule carries with it a dynamic score, or weight, if you will, as well as an explanation. So it'll give you an example of what kind of thing it's looking for, and it will actually show you the specific part of your search filter that flagged on that rule, as well as in the name you can see, it'll actually pull out specific values. So it should be really colorfully obvious, as you'll see in the demo, of exactly why this thing was flagged for this rule. And if you look at the bottom, as I said, we spent over half the time just building this parser. We wrote and rewrote every piece of this parser 2 to 3 times to make it as fast as we possibly could. And in this example, we're parsing this search filter 100,000 times, doing full parsing, full detections, and it's clocking in at just under 4.4 seconds. And that's on a moderately spec laptop, because we know that the volume of search filters in production environments is massive, and so we wanted this to be really usable right out of the box. Shout out to Olaf Hartong at Falcon Force. He was really instrumental in taking all these rules for us and running them multiple times across his entire client data set, since we don't have that data set, and then giving us feedback and stats on, hey, which rules need to be tuned a little bit. So Olaf, if you're watching, thanks so much, buddy. We really appreciate it. So instead of talking more about the solution, let's go into the last section and actually just show a demo. If you haven't picked up on it by now, we really like to have fun. When you spend 2,000 hours on something, you have to trick yourself into being motivated, so we added colors however we can. This is our ASCII art, and it's actually a fully functioning LDAP query that will return any object that has a name property. Clippy seems to like it as well. I can't tell if he's hanging out or trying to eat the terminal or what's going on. So in the first example, this is that Albania Kukas Tirana filter example with a little bit of obfuscation. So if we tokenize it, we can see it breaks out which things are attributes, so values, etc. If we do the enriched tokens, we can now see it says, hey, this is a defined attribute, and it translates to the letter L. And we have these other context objects as well. So if we look at the context object, remember this is things like the Boolean operator. We group all these things into filters so that we can write detection logic against the entire filter. So we can easily access the string values, but then we have a dictionary and list of the full token objects. So all the metadata necessary for tokenization we can find in the filter. And then if we look at the context object for the Boolean operator, we'll see this is a logically inclusive filter. This is tracking that full stack of Boolean operators that you still have direct access to. And then every single value goes through the full value parsing. So any hex characters are parsed. At any time you can look for the raw content or the decoded content. Pipe that into find evil, and we can see these are the individual rules that match for this particular search filter. This is just showing a couple properties. In the next demos, you'll see a little better view of the entirety of the rules. Let's do another parsing example, this time using the bitwise value. So remember all the bitwise breakout were like 515 can be 1, 2, 5, 12. Well, here's a rule that flags and says, hey, if user account control attribute has the flag 128 set to true, then flag this alert. I won't go into the details of why that's an interesting detection, but what I want to show you is when we parse this value, we automatically know this is a bitwise attribute, and we parse the value to get those base 2 add-ins either in a dictionary format or a list format. So you can immediately write detections for combinations of true and false. Now keep in mind this is per filter, so that breakout stuff does complicate it a bit, but you can at least extract the flags and aggregate it back together for your final detections across the entirety of the search filter. The last parsing example is looking for some actually kind of crazy stuff. So decoding hex characters in this first example, that's easy sauce. So this is trusted domain, easy detection. But when it's things like wildcards, they're actually missing characters, so we can't precisely say what the person was looking for. But in our detection module, well, you have the ability to define strings of interest like curve TGT, domain admins, domain controllers, and the parser and the detection rules will go through and actually expand the wildcards and say, hey, does this wildcarded string match any of your sensitive terms? And that also handles the 2 A&R scenarios that Sabi mentioned earlier, with the implicit wildcard or the explicit wildcard. So yeah, those are some really fun detections that go beyond just pure deobfuscation, but really kind of logically looking at some suspicious strings of interest.
And finally, we've put all this together into a colorful interactive menu to make it fun to explore. We can test our input, the LDAP search filter, and we can explore the obfuscation menus for all the techniques we covered in this presentations. Wildcards are also supported. We can add obfuscation layer by layer, and we can also remove it. And if you're lazy, you can use all wildcards to randomly apply all the options. Let's test again. The search filter still works. Detection module is built in, and find evil shows a full summary of detections, scores, explanations, and more colors. Lastly, if you don't like interactive menus, we have full CLI support. So the interactive menu lets you randomly choose ingredients, and you can copy out the recipe for non-interactive user. All the functions for pretty printing and detection summaries are also available via CLI.
Thank you. It's always awkward in blue teamer talks, and they're like, was that a shell? Like, do we clap or not? And so, yeah, our apologies for not including a dramatic pause. But yeah, hopefully that was really fun for everyone. We're almost done here. We just want to reiterate that Sabi and I are both defenders, and from the very beginning of this research, we knew that we had not seen people talking about this, and to be honest, attackers didn't really need this help. So why hand them a fully loaded machine gun when defenders still often don't even have the telemetry in the first place? So from the very beginning, we weren't strong-armed. We decided that we wanted to release this in a unique kind of two-stage approach. So today what we released is everything we talked about minus the obfuscation module. We're releasing a corpus of 1,337 benign obfuscated examples, so you can easily have to run our code to look at examples of obfuscated search filters. For anyone who's really ambitious, you have the full parser, and the deobfuscation modules look suspiciously like the obfuscation one. So if you want to do a little bit, go for it. But just keep in mind, we spent over 1,000 hours on the obfuscation module, so there is a heck of a lot of craziness that we put in there. Our goal, pending a CFP response, is hopefully by the end of this year to do a part 2 of this presentation to focus really deeply on all the differences in client and server-side logging, a lot of the weird scenarios we had to build into the parser to support all of this, and then at that point, releasing the obfuscation module. So yeah, just want to make that really clear. That's clear on the GitHub, which will be in the last slide as well. But again, as defenders, we wanted to try to be as creative as possible and help defenders not be completely throwing tomatoes at us on the stage. And we made this very clear in the CFP process. Big red text, no surprises. So we're really happy that there was support in us doing that kind of release. So the final takeaway is LDAP is still widely used by attackers. It's very valuable, and defensively, it's still kind of immature in terms of detection. It seems to be a lot of kind of string-based detections, and even looking at blog posts of people doing LDAP hunting, there just aren't as many of them as I would like to see, that we would like to see. And then lastly, we released maladaptive to help try to bring awareness to what can happen, to show that we shouldn't just be doing string-based detections, and we're providing the parser in all of our detection modules so that hopefully you can right out of the gate start using it in your environment if you already have a mechanism to get all those search filters. Our unofficial takeaway is we want to leave you with something a little different, and so we want to leave you with each of our favorite Albanian proverb. So I'm going to go first. I'm not a native speaker, so forgive my pronunciation, but mine is Rofsa Malet, which literally means live long like a mountain. It's kind of a blessing of well-being. I like to think of it in this scenario as we just climbed a crazy mountain together. I'm a little out of breath personally, but in this industry, we have to help each other out. We have to recognize the shoulders that we stand on, and so when you see someone else struggling up the mountain trying to understand what you're learning, help them up, get them to the top, and then they'll be able to see the next mountain they're going to climb and the person they're going to bring along with them.
And my favorite expression, and I think the audience would agree with me here, Dibo, is "Të lutem jo më kapse letrash," which it means, please no more paperclips.
It was fun while it lasted. All right, and with that, we just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you, DEF CON, and to all the organizers. We had such a great time putting this research together, and we're really happy to be here. Here's all of our contact information. Here's the link to maladaptive. Please reach out, and we'll be up here for questions. But thank you again for your time. Any brave souls for questions? Questions or criticisms, everything's welcome. One right here, yeah. So the question is, what was our process for finding all the undocumented stuff? Well, sometimes luck, sometimes, I think the best answer that we can give is, people ask us, why do you make obfuscation frameworks? Kind of a little twisted, but it's really a way of kind of working backwards and defining a grammar. Because it's all language, right? What's linguistically, syntactically allowed in a language, whether that's PowerShell or LDAP or anything else. So our understanding is, let's say, actually, when Sabi wrote the hex encoding function, to take values and do hex encoding, we wrote that function, we plugged it into our test harness, and 1 out of every 500 examples would fail. It wouldn't return the same results we expected. And we eventually realized that's because hex values, or hex characters in the value, is not allowed when the extensible match filter is defined. Right? So that is now an incompatibility that no one said anywhere, but our tool helped us find because it found an example that broke what we expected to see. So that's how we found a lot of these examples. And then just some tricks you kind of learn along the way, like, hey, pre-pinning zeros, that seems like something that someone might have thought to ignore because it's insignificant, but it still shows up in logs, therefore it's meaningful to us. And so some of those tricks you just kind of pick up along the way and keep carrying forward. But yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question was, in our research against our obfuscation techniques we found, how effective is Windows Defender or other tools like that? We don't have access to those tools, so actually don't know. In general, I'd say I've spent the last decade doing real-time detections, actually spending some time at Microsoft in different telemetry, looking at how we detect processes and stuff like that on the endpoint. So
thank you for being here.
A lot of our teams criticize blue teams for, why do you make static kind of rigid detections? Sometimes it's out of ignorance. Sometimes.
So I'm glad that you're here. So yeah, now we're talking about our talk, Open CSAM, or how secure is your stuff in your lockers, and this is the main question, basically, which we will talk through the talk. As you might heard, there have been some issues with the talk in the past, so I will kind of address it later. So before we start with the topic, let me introduce myself real quick. So I'm Dennis. I'm a security researcher, or also a hardware hacker. And I basically am interested in wireless and embedded security and privacy. So I take a look at all kind of interesting devices which are around me. Primarily, this is vacuum robots, but I generally look at all kind of things. That's why I call myself also a vacuum robot and IoT collector. So I have probably way over 600, 700 devices and 60 or 70 vacuum robots by now. So my main goal typically is to root vacuum robots, but again, I look at all the other things. And if you're interested in vacuum robots, by the way, I have a website which documents all the hardware and everything. Yeah, one thing which is kind of new in the slides. I have been a target of a cease and desist at DEF CON, so I think this is like a interesting thing, which by the way was withdrawn as today in the morning or in the night. So yeah, and now we would like to introduce Braylon.
Cool. Hi, I'm Braylon. I hack things for the Leviathan security group during the day, but I'm here representing myself as an independent security researcher, and this talk does not reflect their views. My general focus has been application security and APIs, but I've started hardware hacking for fun, looking at things like robots, cameras, and smart locks. And this is my first DEF CON talk, and I was also named in the cease and desist, so that's pretty fun.
All right, so let's talk about some previous work. So this is not necessarily the first log which we took a look at. Like exactly 10 years ago, well, a little bit more than 10 years ago, I was working on a group which looked at Siemens & Voss door locks, and we published a paper about that. Also, some while ago, I was taking a look at Schlage electronic locks, which you find especially in America, like in government buildings, universities. So, what are the goals of this talk? Well, first, we want to give you some overview of the reverse engineering of Digilog and SIG logs. We want to tell you something about vulnerabilities, and we want to show you some ideas and methods how you can extract typically firmware and configurations from that kind of devices. One thing which is the most important part of this talk is basically we want to raise awareness about PIN numbers. As a general side note, we use Digilog and SIG as examples, and we are not claiming that they're more or less secure than other companies. We're kind of just unlucky that they're one of the market leaders and that they build good products. So yeah, so we basically have chosen them because they have a good reputation, they have quality products, we just might have made some mistakes. We reported the things also to the vendors, and Digilog is actively working on fixing the issues, and I will give you some information later on that. So, about this talk. It's basically a continuation of my NullCon talk at NullCon Berlin 24. We focus, and this is the important part, on offline logs which are managed. So if there's like a master key or something, if you think of a gym or master key systems. And we do not cover a couple things. For example, we do not cover management software. We do not cover reprovisioning, so how to factory reset the log. We also don't talk about physical attacks using magnets or destructive attacks like drilling, decapping, all other kind of things. And later on, we have included a statement of Digilog in regard to their cease and desist. All right. So what is our motivation here? So generally, back then when I was looking at logs, I realized quite quickly that hacking logs is not that new. There's a lot of people who were hacking like high security logs, so a lot of researchers were kind of focusing on that, especially like safe logs, because there's probably very important stuff in there. A lot of research has been put into side channel attacks. Safes contain expensive things, and the impact is like very high if they're insecure. The general problem is for manufacturers or for even companies who have this kind of devices, it's very hard to defend against physical attacks and highly motivated attackers. So if as an attacker, if I have unlimited time and money, then I will get into whatever it is. In regard to consumer devices, it's slightly different. So consumer logs, safes, and cabinets are known to be bad. And there's mechanical flaws, there's trivial bypasses, using magnets and other things, and there's insecure software. And I have an example here from one of my favorite YouTubers, a lockpicking lawyer, where he has like a gun safe kind of thing where you put the gun in, and you just pry open the plastic handle, and you can just pull the gun out. You don't care about the lock. So sometimes you don't need to even attack locks. There's other ways around that. Okay, so how did we start with this particular research? So I was at Northeastern University like around 2018, and they introduced lockers in the labs. And one of the ideas was like, you can put your stuff in, and you just choose your own pin, lock it, and if you come back, you unlock it again, and the next one can use it. But also when we were traveling around, we saw like these locks in many, many co-working spaces, banks, airports, hotels, gyms. So we were literally everywhere. At some point, you develop an eye for like interesting things around you. And one thing which we figured out very quickly is there's only a few widely used vendors which are out there. So there's like the groups like in US in particular, like Digilock, or like there's in Europe, SAG. There's some very limited kind of vendors out there. And these kind of locks, they stay for a very, very long time in use, because why would you change a gym lock like after 5 years or after 4 years or whatever? So these things typically stay in use like for 10 years, 20 years until they're broken, basically. Okay. The question is now, why do we hack cabinet lockers or lockers generally and not safes? Well, lockers and cabinets are basically everywhere, and they're used in public spaces or spaces which are accessible to the public or shared workspaces. And there might be many reasons why you want to hack them. For example, you forgot your PIN, you lost your key, or you do a red team penetration test. Also, sometimes the outlet locks are not super correct, so you want to, correct them. And they might contain a lot of interesting stuff, and including our own. And this is like what I want to say is like, one of the reasons why we do the research is because we're kind of slightly annoyed because our stuff is also that kind of lockers. So this is one big motivation from us. So what kind of things you might store there? Well, you might store your backpack, laptop, employee ID, phone, keys, money, credit cards, USB sticks, important documents, your bitcoins, or candy. So the question is, well, did you use the same PIN which you used to lock the locker also for your phone, notebook, or credit card?
Quick survey, who has a friend that does this, who reuses their pins? No, you're not supposed to admit that.
To be fair, in the beginning, before I was doing the research, I caught myself using the same pin all over again, so that, it gets a little bit complicated. Anyway, so what kind of attack ideas do we have, and how do we do it? So what we're looking for generally in these kind of devices, well, we try to extract somehow the firmware, because firmware can give us like some secret backdoors or bugs. It helps us to understand functionality, and it can allow also an attacker to create, custom firmware, like basically declouding or enshrittification of the smart locks. The other thing is, which is obviously the crown jewels here, is the interesting data in terms of like key IDs, user pins, RFID IDs, or log files. And the other thing, if you do lockpicking, you try to find like any easy way to bypass things into open locks. So our idea, and this is like why we want to kind of stress on that, is not necessarily that we want to steal your stuff, but we don't want to steal your stuff anyway, but theoretically as attackers, but lateral movement, and that's the core idea of our talk. So how do we do it? So we have, in this particular example, 3 cabinets. Basically, one of them is open, 2 of them are locked. One is locked with a PIN, the other one is locked with an RFID. And so what we do is like we try to extract the manager key from the locker which is open. As soon as we have the manager key, this is like a key which you use to kind of unlock the locker, to audit things in there so that there's nothing, like the DEF CON hotel, it's like sketchy things, your flipper. And you can lock it again without resetting the PIN. So by having this manager key, what we can do is basically we can unlock other lockers, and we can extract from the lockers, like with the PIN, we can extract the user PIN. At the same time, we can obviously access whatever is in the locker. So if you have a laptop in there, and if you have your phone in there, well, we might be able to use the PIN which you use to lock the locker to unlock that. But it gets even more interesting. Because, well, we can also extract the RFID, ID or secret, in some cases, from a lock which was used to lock the locker with an RFID or employee badge. And then we can go to an interesting door, like a server room or something, and can use that to unlock that. Especially SAG, they use Desfire encryption, so they store the keys, which gets very, very interesting here. All right, so how do you get that kind of locks? What's the logistics behind that? The problem is, if you do that kind of research, you need to invest a lot of time and money, and experiments typically require multiple devices. And you obviously cannot use someone else's property because there might be 1 or 2 breaks in the process of like reverse engineering that. These locks are also expensive, so typically you pay between like more than $100 for a lock and more than $50 for a key, or like way more than $50. We will talk about that later. But the good thing was for us, there's surplus on eBay. And it's a little bit mean, but COVID kind of helped us a little bit because a lot of gyms kind of got bankrupt, so they kind of offsetted their locks and other things on eBay. And we got a lot of like cheap provisioned locks, so locks which were already provisioned to some manager key or programming key, which we were able to play around with. And the other thing is, especially in Germany, we got a lot of locks from failed projects. Basically, we're helping like a big like kind of gym, which kind of didn't happen, so they had like stacks and stacks of these locks, and we kind of sell them on eBay for a cheap price. So we spent probably more than $1,000 or $2,000 on buying random locks, which we don't even have so many lockers for. So. As mentioned, we were going on a shopping tour on eBay and bought like a lot of locks. So let's talk about the Digilock ecosystem, and this is like our first candidate for which devices we looked at. So Digilock itself, we're like a brand of Security People Inc., which is US-based, and they are in the industry for a very, very long time, so very, very experienced, especially also with mechanical locks. They call themselves the global leader in keyless lock solutions, and they have many different bands of locks. So they have connected locks, which we're not talking about. We have offline locks, we have mechanical locks, and as access media, you can use like RFIDs, the pins, key fobs, smartphones with the newest generation, and you might see them under different brands. For example, Digilock, Next, Numeris, so there's different ones. If you take a look at their website, I mean, you kind of say like they're literally in all the industries, which is like, I mean, that's the reason why we kind of saw them in the first place, because we're like in education, in gyms, in some professional sports organizations, so we're literally everywhere. The way how you can typically identify them is, this is some examples right now, by the 3-pin connector which we use, like, which is very specific for Digilock. Other lock vendors use slightly different kind of connectors, but this is like a thing, if you see that, it's kind of like, you kind of know what it is. If you take a look at the lock hardware itself, the good thing for us is they use more or less the same or very similar hardware, so they use a similar type of MCU. So if you're kind of familiar with one of them, you kind of know how the others work in a way. So this makes it also a great kind of thing for us as reverse engineers. And they didn't have temper switches, so if you just assemble one, then there's nothing which triggers, which is, by the way, very, very normal for like, you know, kind of low security or middle security locks. Only safe locks have like some temper switches and other things. The lock state is controlled by the latch, which is kind of interesting for us. I will kind of talk about that later. And because we have so much experience with mechanical locks, we added a lot of mechanical protections against physical attacks. So for example, you cannot use like bypassing things. We tried a couple things with needles, so there's no way to kind of, you know, bypass things. So they did a very good job there. The features which you get per lock are kind of dependent on the brand. So some of them support audit locks, so you can basically record who opened or locked the locker. And they have assigned and shared locker functionality, which means sometimes you can give an employee just one locker and only that person can use it, or you have a scenario like in the gym. If you take a look closer at the hardware, one thing which is kind of great for us is all of them have a PIC programming interface exposed. Many of them have EEPROM. We have obviously an MCU. We have a connection to the inside unit, which kind of contains the latch and the motor, and it gets also power from there. We have a piezo for the sound. And the most interesting thing for us was the interface. As you see, we soldered some wires to that to kind of intercept that, so which is basically one wire. Hardware-wise, if you take a closer look at the microcontrollers, they use most of the times PIC 18 controllers, but sometimes we use, especially newer models, we use PIC 24s. We have EEPROM for audit locks and for credential storage in some of the devices. And if you have a device which supports RFIDs, you have ST kind of controller for NFCs. Or the newer ones have a logic IC, which kind of is also an HSM. And from what they told us, basically, in new generations of these locks, we use HSM to store kind of some kind of secrets, which we can confirm because it's not on eBay right now, so I need to wait until it shows up on eBay. So yeah, so if you look at inside the lock hardware, the thing which for me as someone who's like doing physical security for quite a while is like it's extremely well built and engineered. And what I mentioned before is that the inside lock kind of defines if it's locked or unlocked. You have like some read contacts which are kind of sensing if the latch is like locked or not locked. There's also different variants of the lock, like where everything is just in the front, and we have again read contacts which kind of detect a couple things. But all of the locks have like some kind of debug pins. So let's talk about keys. So there's a bunch of keys, and you see we have a stack of them because we were going on shopping trips. The most important one is the yellow key, which is the programming key. Only one of them exists in the locking system. This is basically the main provisioning key. It allows you to add manager keys, remove them, to override the lock. So if you need to open the lock, it also is used to power that lock. So if the battery is empty, you can use it to power jump it. And it has some additional functions like cloning functionality, audits, and some other things. Another key which is important is the black key, which is the manager key, and this is basically typically your administrator, whatever has it, to kind of you forgot the pin to open the locker so that you can get your stuff, or to kind of check if you have a flipper in there, illegal flipper in there. So this is kind of things which it's used for. And one thing which is very special for Digilock, and this is like kind of I think one very important feature for a lot of people, is the so-called ADA key, which is in blue, and ADA means Americans with Disabilities Act. So this key allows you basically for people who cannot enter a pin physically, you just tap the key fob, and it will kind of act as a pin or as a key. Yeah. So if you take a look closer into these keys, well, all of them are kind of the same. So programming and manager keys, by the way, have exactly the same hardware, just the case is different, but price-wise, they are very different. They have a battery in there, they have a PIC 18, and they have, again, very nice for us, a PIC programming interface. The ADA key is basically an I button, which will be later we will use for some things. There's one special key, which we're not going too deep into it. It's the so-called data key, and what it does is basically connects over USB to a tablet, and you can basically use this programming and manager key. You can have audit locks, you can pull things, you can clone locks, and some other things. So this is like an additional thing, which I think we have in there's 5th generation or something. It's a little more expensive, but it doesn't matter for us. All right. So what is the key communication between the communication between lock and key? And the thing here is, which you probably figured out very quickly already, is one wire. And one wire, by the way, is a very standard protocol. You find it in a lot of alarm systems. You find it like if you go to a restaurant to unlock the cash register and some other things. It's a it's a very standard kind of thing, which makes it great to be intercepted with logic analyzer. So there's some tools out there which you can use to kind of basically decode the stream. They use the read-wrong command to kind of ask the key for like its ID, and the key returns 8 bytes of ID to the lock, and this is like basically authentication. And the key types are identified basically by the first byte of the ID. One thing which is like important if you want to do side channel attacks or timing attacks, the bus resets of every transaction. In our talk at Nuke, we kind of described how potentially go do side channels. One key thing to take away here is we don't use any crypto, so we kind of rely on whatever security guarantees one wire has. All right, I want to give a quick rundown of PIC MCUs because it's kind of important to understand what's going on here. So PICs generally are microcontrollers by microchip. They're very common in locks, so literally everyone is using them. Siemens uses them, Schlage uses them, KitLock uses them, Macquarie, so everyone uses them. And they are ideal because they are low power and ideal for battery operations. There's two flavors which we see for Digilock in particular, or for also other locks. It's a PIC 18, which is a 8-bit MCU, which was released back in 2000, and a PIC 24, which has a 16-bit MCU, which has no EEPROM data on board. So basically, you can flash a firmware onto it, but you need to store your data somewhere else. Okay, so this is an example of a random PIC 18. So we have some SRAM, we have flash, we have EEPROM as mentioned, and we have support some protections. For example, you can enable code protection, you can enable write protection, and there's also like a thing which is called external block table read. And on the right, you can see it's consisting of multiple blocks, and at the bottom is like the EEPROM part. So let's talk about code protection. Speaking of which, code protection is, I think, a very PIC-specific term. If you work with other processors, you might know it as read-out protection. And the basic idea is we have an example block, which is not an example block, just an example chip, where the first two blocks are protected, the data is protected, and if you connect our programmer to it, what will happen is we will get, for the blocks which are protected, all zeros, but the blocks which are not protected, we get data back. So write protection, similar thing. The first two blocks are protected, the last one is protected. If you try to write with our programmer something to that, the writes will fail for them, but the other blocks are programmed. Speaking of security of these chips, these MCUs, they offer basically only basic protection against attacks. So there's many attacks which exist for these chips, even if protections are enabled. There's optical laser attacks back in 2002. There's UV erasure attacks. There's glitching. There's like overwriting of individual blocks. So there's a lot of attacks out there. So a lot of people can already figure out how to break these chips. Okay, let's talk about the attacks. So our naive approach was like, hey, what happens if you just connect a debugger and we do some magic with power and other things? It's not as real as it seems. And we tried to dump the MCU. We had the luck that we exposed the data pins, both for the locks and the keys. And one thing which we found is basically that the protection settings which we did on the locks were very inconsistent. So what do we mean with that? So typically, as mentioned, if read-out protection is enabled, you get all zeros back, like on the right side. And one thing which we saw very quickly is that we didn't have write protection enabled, which is by itself not really an issue. But the bigger thing was that if you use an external EEPROM, like this external chip that is not encrypted, so you can dump it basically. And this is basically the result which we had for the manager keys, for the data keys, and everything. One thing which we'll see is for most locks which use like more modern chips, they are not protecting the code, and all of them are not protecting the EEPROM, which is in case of some of them doesn't matter too much, but for especially the locks it matters a lot. So what are we doing? So for unprotected devices which don't have any code protection enabled, we can just dump the code memory and the EEPROM directly. So we need to program in some other hardware, but generally, if you work with embedded systems, you know how to do that. For partially protected devices, it gets a little bit more tricky. So this is an example for a lock which had the first three blocks protected, but the code was creeping into the fourth one, which was not protected. So what we were doing is we can dump the fourth block, and you can put a custom dumper into that block, which hopefully gets hit by some code or branch link, and then you can dump the other ones. There's some other methods out there, but because we're kind of cache strapped and don't want to spend too much time on like buying more locks of the same kind of thing and hoping that it's the same firmware, this is basically one of the things you can do. Otherwise, you can just access EEPROM data directly, so as the same as the other ones. We described this attack at NuCon in the talk, so if you're interested in that, but it's a very generic attack, it's kind of well known for quite a while. So basically, the firmware extraction can be successful for all the locks, so we can get back the firmware. You can analyze the firmware, you can modify it if you want. You can basically load it into Ghidra because there's big support. There's no real signatures and integrity checks, which is kind of normal for that kind of things. And the methods are well established. Basically, but the thing for us is like we don't necessarily need to even look at the firmware if you have the data, so that's just like a thing. So let's talk about EEPROM contents because that's where the current rules are. And one thing is it requires quite a while and a lot of trial and error to figure out which data fields are for what, especially if you have only provisioned blocks and you don't have like clean locks, which you provision, then you can see what the differences are. And the data fields also differ slightly between lock generations and between lock types. So this is not accurate for all the locks. It's just one example for like an older fourth generation lock. But what we see typically is we have a partial programming ID. We see the amount of manager keys. We see what kind of manager keys provisioned on that. We see if like a pin was set, AD key ID or like an RFID UID, so if you tap RFID. And there's also failed pin counter, and for all the locks, bad things might happen if you run over that. Just don't. Okay, as a general observation is some locks don't write the user pin or the key after it has been unlocked by the user, and some, especially newer versions, do. So at some point, I think they figured out this problem and they kind of fix that. All right, so let's talk about emulation and cloning keys. Well, and this kind of thing applies to both RFIDs and keys. So we only need the ID basically to clone the key, and we can extract it from the key or the flash depending on what kind of media we have. And we can emulate it with an Arduino, with a Flipper0, or in case of RFIDs with a Proxmark. The thing is, it looks a little bit easy, but you have to kind of build like a custom PCB which does a couple things to kind of wake up the lock in a particular way. So it's not as trivial as you can do it right now. You need to kind of put some effort into that. So don't go home and just program an Arduino. It won't work. All right. What kind of other ideas would you have if you want to attack them? Well, you can try to brute force pins and keys, which works for all the locks very well, but for new locks not so much. You can do sidechain attacks, which works for all of them, as far as we know, but it's very complicated. It takes like days. You can clone the lock configuration by one wire if you have a valid key, and you can try to modify the contents of EEPROMs. Also, you could think of like building a malicious firmware. We thought about that, but I mean, it's not really necessary to do. If you're interested in the first two attacks, you can take a look at the slides at NuCon. Now, probably one of the reasons why you guys here is the cease and desist incident. So our talk was basically meant to be on Friday at 11 a.m. And the day before at 2 p.m. we basically got an email cease and desist, which kind of contained a couple things like Copyright Act, Defend Trade Secrets Act, obviously other things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the DMCA. And the interesting thing here is, and I want to especially thank Corey to kind of connect us so quickly, who's sitting in front, thank you. By 3:30, basically slightly more than an hour later, we were sitting already in a hotel room and talking to lawyers from the EFF and also from Kurt, and we were basically figuring out what was going on. And so to kind of, because it was very short notice, we kind of moved the talk from Friday to Sunday. We probably could have given the talk on Friday, but we decided like, okay, it might be worth to kind of figure out what's going on. On Saturday, so yesterday we had a phone call involved with everyone. We kind of exchanged views. We kind of resolved our differences, and in that call we kind of pulled the cease and desist back. And officially today, shortly after midnight, we got like the withdrawal in writing for the cease and desist. One thing which I want to quickly say is like there's like a kind of official response from Digilog. They kind of acknowledge that we communicated with them prior to DEFCON. We gave them the slides even, which was maybe a mistake, maybe not. They promised to do some improvements. For example, they want to enable code protection on their locks. For the data blocks, they want to enable for the firmware. We want to encrypt in somehow the communication between the keys and the lock, so that you cannot clone the UID anymore, and they want to encrypt EEPROM data if it's external. They also told us that in over 32 years we had no reported security incidents due to hacked lock, which I believe. And they also very committed to the secure solution for their customers. And I put their full statement, which they sent us on slide 70, so if you look later on the slides, you find it in the back. All right, that's all for Digilog. Let's move on to the next company and bring them.
Cool. So let's shift gears and talk about a couple of other brands that we took a look at as far as locker locks go. The first one being Schulte Schlagbaum AG. So this is a German company. They've been in business since 1833, so quite an old company. These are more widely used in Europe and Germany. They produce both mechanic and electronic locker locks. We took a look at the brand called Safetronic. They also produce door locks, but we didn't take a look at those. We think they might be on the same platform, but we're not entirely sure. So the electronic locks accept both PIN and RFIDs, or RFID plus pins as access mediums, and they do provide audit log support. So let's talk about the LS series of locks. These are based on the STM32 MCU, and they also have SPI EEPROM. As for security, we found that SWD and debugging was not disabled, and their EEPROM is not encrypted. And we noticed a lack of physical tamper switches in the locks. So as you can see, these are PCBs for 3 different locks. We think that they tried to save money by using the same design for nearly a decade. They use the same PCB, but they leave ICs unpopulated. So if you buy a lock that has pin support, you'll get an MCU for the keypad and a different MCU for RFID, and you'll get both for the RFID and pin supported locks. We also noted a difference in SPI EEPROM sizes. Okay, so let's talk about the management keys for some of the RFID SAG locks. So their RFID locks support MyFair Classic, MyFair Deskfire, and some ISO compatible tags. For the higher end locks, there are special RFID keys that are required for programming. There's a master key 1 and 2. Those are used for unlocking and relocking lockers. There's also a data RFID tag for data transport if you need to like pull audit logs off of certain locks. There's also like a physical communicator device, which is like an advanced handheld programmer, but we didn't take a look at that. We tried to procure a set of these programming keys, but they were $1,400 for 8 MyFair Classic tags. So we didn't think it was worth the money, so we didn't take a look at those. So just a quick overview on how we dumped EEPROM contents, just using an SOIC clit. We were able to interface with the EEPROM and dump the contents, as you can see in the hex file. We were able to pull the master pin and the user set pin, so this is just totally unencrypted EEPROM with pins that are available for anyone who can read it to see it. We also found that there are audit logs on the EEPROM as well. There are 500 entries, including a timestamp and a status code, with the status code 50 allowing you to see used pins and the RFID UIDs that have been used. So the last 500 you can see, yeah, all of that. So how did we extract firmware? We noticed on the PCB there was solder mask covering the SWD like copper pad, so we scratched that off and we were able to interface with it and connect to SWD, and that allowed us to see that the devs didn't set the read protection byte, and as such we were able to get the full firmware from these locks. So there are a couple of physical flaws on these locks. We noticed that the motor power wires and potentially debug pins are accessible from outside of the lock through like a clipped plastic cover. So there's just a huge gap. As you can see, the power wires to the actual like motor. And yeah, as you can see on the right, we were able to fit like a whole card under there, so that might allow us to tamper with the lock motor and do some physical hacking there. So we'll talk about a couple of other manufacturers now. One of them being Compaq Security Company. This is a US company founded in 1903, so again, another pretty old company. We took a look at the regulator series. These use the PIC 16 MCU, and these locks accept user pins, technician pins, master pins, and there is some audit logging support for some models. As for security, we found that code data and write protection were enabled on all these locks, so that's good for them, but not very fun for us, so we kind of moved on. But we took a look at their documentation and saw what they were using for a programming/audit tool, an Excel spreadsheet. I don't know what kind of Excel macro hell is happening here. I'm glad I'm not the person who has to maintain this and write this, but if it works for them, I'm happy for them. So next we'll talk about KitLock. This is a sub-brand of CodeLocks. This is a UK-based company founded in 1991. This also uses the PIC 16 MCU, and again accepts user pins, technician pins, and master pins. And again, they had code data and write protection enabled, so good for them, not fun for us. So for good measure, we took a look at a couple of no-name RFID locks from Amazon and eBay. These are just like $20 locks, super cheap. We took them apart and found that they had EEPROM and some kind of mystery MCU. If you like mystery MCUs and know what this is, let us know. Obviously, you can't really have many expectations of security on these cheap devices, so there's no encryption, no protection, and plain text RFID UIDs are just there for anyone to read it. Okay, so we're going to do a quick demo now to show how you can hack some of these locks.
All right, due to the season, we will change the demo slightly. So usually we were kind of thinking of doing like a whole rundown how we can extract manager keys and other things. What I would do instead is like I would showcase our custom PCB, which we built ourselves and took us like some time to develop it. What it basically does is it emulates the same function as a manager key. So I will just show you. So I locked all the lockers from Digilock in this case, and I will just kind of show how I can hopefully open them again. Yeah.
Okay, just like a quick example of a theoretical scenario. So we're going to assume that the attacker has access to any open locker or cabinet with the tools, the microchip Picket 3 debugger, a Phillips screwdriver, and an Arduino and/or flipper. We're using the flipper here. So our criminal has already set the key onto the flipper, and we are able to access the locks.
Yeah, so to be fair, we put a lot of effort into like figuring it out already. So this is like basically if you got access to a lock, you can somehow extract that. You build kind of that kind of tool. There's a magic backside which we don't show. The attack will work very quickly after that. Now the obvious thing is if you want to extract secrets from these locks, you need to kind of disassemble them. So you need a screwdriver. The locks which are kind of just having the front part are super annoying because you need like a very special key to kind of unscrew them. But generally, like to open and relock them again without resetting the original pin, that's basically all you need. But this might take you some time to do. All right, that's for that. Let's go to the conclusion.
Okay, in summary, we were able to extract firmware and keys from these brands of locks. So access to one lock can give you access to all locks in one system or one location. Cloning and emulating keys is possible. And these attacks don't require complicated tools and are sometimes cheap unless you're using the flipper. That's a little bit more expensive. But so how secure is your stuff in electronic lockers? Not super secure. But we need to be fair because these locks are not being sold as high security devices. They're not promising like military grade security or anything. These are just standard use locks. So how can we fix this? Of course, we would recommend a security by design approach from the beginning. So enable all security features and always expect physical attacks when you're producing locks. Encrypt your secrets, store them in a secure way. So the best solution for vulnerable locks would be to have firmware updates for all of them, but depending on the age of the locks, this might not be possible, and in our opinion, it seems unfixable. So the workaround could be to use a programmer to enable code protection, but this only works if data is stored on the MCU and not on an external EEPROM chip. So this task is kind of complicated for an average non-tech savvy user, so it's not a reasonable expectation. So the likely solution would be to buy new locks or just ignore the problem and hope it goes away. So takeaway lessons. Please don't reuse your important pins for lockers, like public use lockers. Again, don't reuse your pins for your debit cards, your phone. Use separate things. We're all using separate passwords now for everything, I hope. So treat your pin like a password and never loan out your electronic keys. And always be aware of security limitations of devices. And you cannot trust audit logs of these devices because they can be tampered with. So even experienced and big companies make mistakes. And developing stuff is way harder than breaking it in 90% of cases. So be nice to developers. It's hard when people are attacking your stuff. And always remember there might be interesting cyber physical systems around you. So don't forget the human factor. Can you just ask nicely for the manager key? So final notes, please don't break into lockers you don't own. I know these systems are in a lot of places, hotels and such, but please don't. Messing with these locks can also permanently brick them, which is kind of the standard expectation when you're hardware hacking. You can always brick things quite easily. Be careful. There are more attacks that we haven't covered here, and other companies and products are possibly vulnerable too, and just because they claim that they've never been hacked doesn't mean they're unhackable, of course. And yeah, thanks all.
So I would like to also give special thanks to Kari, who kind of connected us with Dolores, to Tara, who did that, to our council, Hannah and Kurt, and to Andrew, and everyone at EFF. And this kind of gave me, again, a motivation to definitely donate a lot of money to the EFF. One maybe a side story is that Braylon was at B-Sides before this event and was getting a membership for EFF and was kind of joking like, oh, we might need you tomorrow. And lo and behold, literally one day after that, on her birthday, of all the facts, she got both of us got a cease and desist letter. So if you have questions, we might be still around here. Otherwise, feel free to contact us. Yeah, and thank you very much for being here. Right, so yeah, if you also want to read the statement, it'll be in the slides, and I hope we will find a solution also to kind of fix the older logs. So there's probably a way we will figure it out together. Thank you.
Starting to get a rhythm where we know how to play to those strengths. And you'll see things like campaigns where we have multiple agencies involved in that. FBI doing domestic stuff with their legal authority with DOJ, combined with Cyber Command doing some extra outside the U.S. activity to do takedowns in conjunction with FBI doing internal U.S. CISA working with industry and doing that campaign to synchronize the things that are across the civilian infrastructure, and then NSA lending technical expertise and foreign intelligence in that mix. And we're getting better and learning all the time on how we do those. The National Cyber Director was created to kind of be that band conductor across all of them. And so, we've got that apex. In reality, a lot of the activity today is ground up. And when I say that, I mean one agency has either a special insight, a special relationship, a team that's been working, and then they start to bring the players in that can collaborate and add to that mix. And then, the ONCD and others then do the convening to bring us all around the execution and synchronization. That because the roles are enshrined in statute and law and policy, will continue throughout administrations. The nice thing about cybersecurity, it's something that's fairly bipartisan. Everybody can get behind the need to stop foreign adversaries into our spaces. So I am optimistic that the trajectory continues. The biggest shortcoming, and I heard an ask about the shortcoming I see today, is the scope and scale of the threats against the resources and the innovation that comes from the attackers into the vulnerability space. And you see a lot of effort into, we've got to get to the point where we do the things we know matter, right? We've got to get on two-factor authentication. We've got to get companies building more secure software. We've got to get out of some of the memory unsafe languages and get the core technologies over into things that are defendable and defensible. And then we've got to build the staffs and teams. And I think, Jeff, to your question about automation, the scope and scale is so hard on some of these threats. And having a big enough team to defend 24/7, and who wants to work that graveyard shift in the middle of the night on a holiday, automation helps take the pressure off some of that. So I like the trajectory we're on. It is a journey, though. It is a long journey, and we're just we're on the path.
All right, thank you, Rob. Thank you for your service. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and we'll see you around the con.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Usually when this presents itself in two forms, either a call, a restricted call to ZW map your section, or that can map whatever physical address in a linear address, or by using mmap IO space. Now, the vulnerable pattern that we found the most was this. It's abusable. It's less abusable than ZW map your section because these actually provide access that you can't specify the access rights, so you can't specify read-write instead of read, and this usually is used for privilege escalation. So if you have a pattern that like this, so you have a call to mmap IO space, IO allocate MDL, and then mm build MDL for non-page pool, and then mmap locked page specify cache, you have a pattern where you can actually allocate non-page pool memory in a user mode buffer, and using a technique known as proc scanning, you can identify e-process structure in the non-page pool and swap tokens around to achieve privilege escalation. And then there is the prince of all other vulnerabilities, arbitrary kernel virtual memory read-write. This presents itself in a lot of different ways. It can be a mem move, a mem copy, a ZW write virtual memory. It can be a direct pointer assignment. It can be whatever. Now, this is used for a lot of different stuff, let alone bypass DSC, for example, or just mapping arbitrary stuff in memory, in kernel memory. And this is heavily abused by tools like ADMapper or KDU to load your driver in memory. Now, of course, Windows doesn't like this, so they started introducing a lot of different mitigations. Since 2018, there was the introduction of KPTI after the Spectre meltdown attack. Then they started introducing VBS, virtualization-based security, and started enforcing HVCI. After the HVCI, they introduced KDP, which we will see. And then they implemented the Microsoft driver block list. And afterward, they started introducing support first for kernel chat, control enforcement technology that neutralizes ROP-based attack. And then in like weeks ago, they announced that Windows 11 24H2 will support Intel VTRP, redirection protection, that kills another bug class that we will gonna see like now. So VBS is for exploiting vulnerable drivers, because HVCI want to prevent you from abusing a vulnerable driver to load your VTL0 rootkit in memory. Now, how it works? Well, you have now the Windows runs on top of the hypervisor, and it divides the trust level in two trust levels, the VTL1 and VTL0. Now, your own kernel runs in VTL0. Now, this is the guest operating system, the guest OS, and what it does is that this uses a normal page-structured approach for address resolution, to map a physical address into a linear address. So you have your CR3, you have your PML4 entry, then you have your page directory pointer entry, then you have your page directory entry, the page table entry, and then finally you have your physical address. This physical address, though, is a guest physical address, meaning that there is another layer, second layer access translation, that translates a guest physical address into a real physical address that is managed entirely by the hypervisor using extended page tables. Now, what is the problem for us? Is that before this was introduced, page protection was kernel-based. So when you had control of kernel, you could do literally anything. So if you had a virtual read-write, you could literally locate the GG options, for example, that is the global variable and like managing the driver signature enforcement, and you could just override it. You could nullify it, load your unsigned code, and then restore it, of course, because even though it was possible to modify it, it was still protected by kernel patch guard. So KPP, kernel page patch guard.
Plus 20 years on
but now,
I don't know if you can ever actually bring closure to a family in these kind of cases, but we were able to get them some answers, and that meant that they could have a celebration of life ceremony, and we got them a little bit of justice, so I'm very proud of that. We also, this pisses me off. On these cases like this, the killers are always the focus. If you Google Carrie Farber's name, you immediately find a picture of the person who harmed her. And so Dodie Avis and I, we want to do something positive in her name, so we started a scholarship at the community college she attended. It's for IT students like her. I know all of you lost your money on slots last night or whatever, but if you have a rich uncle or aunt, tell them to go farberscholarship.org, give something. If not, if you don't have money, just remember the victims. Always remember the victims. Remember Carrie Farber, not her killer. And this has been a dream come true for me. I've wanted to give a DEF CON main talk for 15 or 20 years, and I had one goal leading up here, was to do that. Now I have a new goal, and that is to give a longer DEF CON talk. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. See me in the hallway after for questions, and I even have these nifty little cards that I'll give you. They're great. Thank you.
you can't change the options to 0 anymore. So what is the strategy around this? Well, luckily someone very smart, smarter than me, of course, developed a technique which is called page remapping. And page remapping attack exploited, it's not a bug, it's like a limitation of KDP. KDP doesn't enforce how pages on the guest are translated to pages on the host system. Meaning that, not enforcing that, what I can do, one possible thing I can do is, I can copy over the content I want to modify to another page. I can modify the page structures on VTL0 to make it point to a read-write page on the hypervisor level. And this will effectively make my page read-write. And I can modify then the content. So Satoshi Sanda developed a proof of concept and used a null byte page to nullify DSC in exact this way. Now, this is also abusable for executing arbitrary code. And we have two main strategies for executing arbitrary code, even if HVCI is enabled. So this depends a lot on the Intel CPU level. So if you have any CPU that is before Tiger Lake, before 11th generation, you can still use ROP because this kind of CPU do not support chat. So you can use kernel forge. Kernel forge is a technique implemented firstly by Crash and also discussed by Conor McGar in a blog post. And he uses a thread and a dummy event to modify the kernels, the thread kernel stack at runtime, meaning that it will replace frame on kernel side of a thread to make it execute a ROP chain on return, executing arbitrary code. And if instead you have a CPU that is before 12th generation, you can use the page remapping attack, as I said, that abuses malc. Now, why before 12th generation? I can say, actually, I should say a CPU before 12th generation and before Windows, and a version of Windows before 24H2, because, as I said, Windows 11 24H2 and supports Intel BTRP. That is a killer exactly for this kind of attack, for page remapping attack. So it avoids any user from being able to redirect a page from VTL0 to remap to another page in the host system. Now, and what about if we have something? What about if we have something more? I'm actually exploring some other technique for trying to bypass HVCI, but currently these are the only way. I thought that large pages could also be used for this kind of thing, but apparently it's not really working. So, but we still, even if we can do stuff, we still need to load a vulnerable driver to execute any of these strategies. So if we want to load a vulnerable driver, we need to be aware that there is something called driver block list that will probably prevent us from loading a known vulnerable driver on Windows. Now, the driver block list is a blacklist, and of course it has some problems that were identified by Will Dorman and Yarden Shafir, another researcher. The block list by itself is just a collection of hashes and file names and file versions that are supposed to be not loaded on Windows. And if the driver block list is enabled, it will prevent normal vulnerable drivers to be loaded, but it has a measure flow. The coverage is ridiculous. So I made a little script to check how many drivers were blocked from the load driver projects. These just check the hashes, but it's really ridiculous. The coverage is really ridiculous, and also it can be disabled by admin. Of course, when we bypass the block list, we need to be aware that there is also the CRL. So even if a driver is not in the block list, it doesn't mean that the certificate is still valid. So there are other things that may prevent us from loading a vulnerable driver on Windows. And now, to the meat of this presentation, what can we do to load a vulnerable driver on Windows using this unusual technique? So let's talk a bit about the anti-object manager. So the anti-object manager is a subsystem on Windows that provide access to resources using a name value approach. It's not entirely correct, but it's the most accurate simplification. It provides access to these objects using a unified API, and like every object it can be indexed by using a name, can be recovered using a name, and these names are categorized in categories that we call namespaces. Now, you probably already seen the object manager in WinObject, sysinternals, and you can see a graphical representation of the object manager. So you have all these objects with the type associated, and you have the name categorized in namespaces. Now, usually this is actually used, this categorization is used because any namespace has a certain accessibility. So if I want, for example, to make an object available to the Win32 layer, I usually use a symlink that connect the global, which is the global namespace, to the specific object I want to connect it with. And this is what you usually do even with drivers, for example. Now, the anti-object manager of course, provides access to other subsystems like the I/O manager, the process manager, the memory manager, etc. And whenever an object of type file is accessed by the I/O manager will immediately check the file object and will dispatch it to the relevant driver that is meant to handle that specific file object. Now, the NTFS driver manages the NTFS file system. What kind of file system is the NTFS file system? So the NTFS is a complex file system. It was always designed by Microsoft for extensibility and to support different kind of other file systems like FAT32, etc. And the main thing that I want you to memorize for now is that every file on Windows is a set of attributes, of course, and every file has at least one stream associated. So every file on Windows can actually be referred to as a triple. It's a triple, either. So and usually you have, I don't know what I'm saying. So usually you have the file name, the stream type, the stream name, and the stream type. Every file has at least one stream. So if you create a file with just the file name, you are immediately, it means that the stream name and the stream type are defaulting back to something. For files is the data stream, and for directories you have the index allocation stream. But they are usually always a triple. Now, another thing I want you to memorize is the concept of reparse points. Because it was meant for extensibility, NTFS supports a lot of type of reparse point. The most common reparse points that you will see in NTFS are 3, although there are like 20 or 30 different reparse tags, so reparse point types. So the most common are junction points that links directory to directories, mount point that links directories to mounted drives, and symbolic links that link files to other files. So this is not to be confused with link file. Link file are regular files. They have a data stream, and they are just regular files. They need to be parsed to access to another location on the file system. Indeed, symbolic links are an NTFS features, meaning that they are just literally link on NTFS. They link directly on NTFS to another file. And usually, a reparse point is always a reparse tag, which in this case is symbolic link, and a reparse data that will actually point to the real file that is pointed to. Now, about CDFS. CDFS is a way more, it's a way simpler file system. It just comprises a root directory, and then it has directory and then there's directory entries and file entries that are associated and are always parsed from the root directory. Is an implementation of the ISO 9667s and 9660, and the important thing is that this CDFS file system, is applies to optical disk as much as applies to ISO files. So ISO files are a virtual implementation of this CDFS file system. Now, just to give a bit of difference to the NTFS, of course, CDFS does not support reparse point, does not support a lot of things that are supported by the NTFS, but also it has a completely different threat model. So NTFS supports rich permissions. So it has an ACL, and the ACL is associated with different AC entries, access control entries, which define what can be done on each file by each user in the system. For CD file system, this is not a problem because the content on a CD is supposed to be immutable. So everyone has access to a file system. If you mount a drive, anyone, an admin, a regular user, anyone has access to the mounted files, to the files on the mounted drive. And yeah, as I said before, the CDFS driver, as much as NTFS driver, communicates with the I/O manager. The I/O manager has a request to access a file, and after passing through the filter manager, it provides access to the required NTFS or CDFS driver accordingly to what is the device driver associated with the file object. Now, when you load an ISO on Windows, the CTFS driver will automatically load the content of this ISO file using the CD command read. Now, one thing that I want to stress out here is that an ISO file, in comparison with a CD, with an optical CD, an ISO file is mapped in physical memory.
And I mainly do automotive security. So also a lot of theoretical stuff. I look at protocols and standards and do a formal analysis of these standards to see if they meet certain security goals.
Yeah, hello from my side too. I'm Yannis. I'm also a PhD student at our small automotive research group called ACSD, Automotive Cyber Security Darmstadt. It's located in Germany. I've finished my master's at the end of the last year, and now I'm a PhD student about resilience in the automotive topic, but also for IoT systems. Means what happens if an ECU in a car breaks or is going to be compromised, how you can migrate functionality to another ECU and strengthen the safety inside the car by such a resilient concept. Our research group is also very focused on teaching. We have a lecture called Automotive Security, and therefore we have to motivate students, of course, and that's why we have created this motivating and beginner-friendly talk and our project V2G to get students excited and motivated about the topic of automotive research. Maybe the most important member of our research group is our research car. It's a Volkswagen ID.3. It's an electric vehicle. And since, of course, we are German, so we have to do research on the Volkswagen, I think. Usually, the initial step of the automotive research, but also all other security research, is considering attack vectors. And that's what we have to do also for the automotive context. You can see there are various attacks, it's a huge attack surface. First of all, you have long-range attacks, you have short-range attacks, but you have also physical attack possibilities. For the long-range attacks, for example, the cellular communication between the car and the backend of the OEM, for example, for over-the-air updates. In newly upcoming cars, you have also the V2X communication, cars communicating to each other about their location, about their speed. You have cars communicating with road signs to get a status about the allowed speed, for example, of this street section. You have short-range attacks, that's more or less classical cybersecurity, considering Bluetooth, Wi-Fi connection for your infotainment system, between the smartphone, for example, for playing via Apple CarPlay, for example, the music on your car. And the maybe most interesting and car-specific attack vectors are these physical attacks. That's the bus systems inside the car. There's several of them, but we want to focus on two, and we go into them a little bit later in detail, because we need them for our V2G project, getting all information required for our game controller out of this car. So here you can see our two main research cars. We are focused on electric vehicles, so on the left side you can see our Volkswagen ID.3, on the right side you can see the Tesla Model 3. We use them for practical research. Tim also introduced him as a theoretical researcher. I'm also more theoretical part, but you cannot do the whole time theoretical research. So you have to do tinkering around with a car. That's also good for the motivation.
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of information you just get when you look at the actual car, because the manufacturers won't tell you. And also for students, it's quite cool to do research on the actual cars and projects.
So we have equipped our cars with lots of techniques to get information about them. And we show you in the following how we have done this. That's the back of the Volkswagen ID.3. We've equipped this with lots of measurement techniques. On the right, you can see so-called vector boxes. They're from a German company called Vector. That's why we call them vector boxes. They're for capturing different buses inside the car. And we have equipped the car in a way that we can get a holistic view over all relevant buses in this car. On the left side, you can also see some interesting parts more for the electrical engineers. We have equipped the car with so-called LAMP sensors. They are current measuring sensors via induction. You can clip them on the high voltage system wires to measure the current. And the idea behind this holistic view between physical and messages inside the car is to get that we can compare those data and get correlations between the actual physical measurements and the recorded, for example, canvas data. As I've already introduced from a theoretical way, there's also a practical attack surface, of course. On the left side, you can see classical key fob attacks using an SDR. Maybe all of you have heard about the roll jam attack. You jam the signal of the key fob because it's using a rolling code, and the owner of the car will press a second time, and you have recorded both signals, and you resend the older one because the car haven't heard this already, and so you have a newer one for the car unlocking this in the future without the owner get any notice about this. In the mid, you can see for automotive and classical attack surface also unsoldering the chips where the firmware is located on, because you have physical access to your car. If you own the car, you can do anything you like with it, more or less. So that's why we have unsoldered the eMMC chip to get in contact with the firmware. That's the same we've done with the key fob. You can see here there was the memory chip. And maybe another interesting part is that you then can directly connect with, here you can see such a vector box, to the internal buses of the car. Here you can see one such a ECU, and we have connected this box with the CAN bus of the ECU controlling messages. But before we go therefore a little bit in detail how these messages look like, first we have to understand what this CAN bus actually is. How can we talk to those cars? For a game controller, we require, as I've already mentioned, information about specific actuators of the car. For example, the steering wheel. We want to later want to transfer the angle of the steering wheel to our virtual game controller. So we have to get this information out of the car. And this information is transferred via the CAN bus. The topology of such a car looks like follows. It's a very condensed view, it's a very simplified view of our Volkswagen ID.3, where you can see there's a main gateway ECU and several domains. Each domain consists of several other ECUs, and each of those domains is separated in a way that based on criticality of those functionality and the ECUs. For example, in the middle domain you can see, in the drive domain you can see there's located the engine ECU, but also the brake ECU. They're all safety relevant, so they're very critical for the safety behavior of the car. On the left side, you can see a separated domain with less criticality for example, the lights, light controlling inside the car. The special thing in this topology is that those domains are separated based on this gateway ECU. The gateway ECU is responsible for shielding the inside of the car against the outside, because maybe you know this from combustion engine, the outside of the car is connected with a so-called OBD2 port. It's for diagnosis. If you bring your car to a garage, they will plug there in, and you want to prevent that via the OBD2 port everyone can read everything of the car. So that's why such a gateway ECU is introduced into this topology. but this strongly depends on the actual car you want to consider. That's just for the Volkswagen ID.3 and the group of vehicles from Volkswagen. Now we get a little bit into detail about this CAN bus. The CAN bus was developed by Bosch in 1986. It's a dual-wire twisted pair cable, and as I said before, it's a bus topology. What does it mean? A bus topology means that the ECUs are connected to the same wire or wire pair, and all ECUs get the same state of information in the respective time frame. We have a frequency of this in this CAN bus, and all this information is distributed in this time frame to all ECUs connected to this CAN bus. It's also a multi-master protocol, means that all ECUs can send and receive on demand, and there's no master required to control them. Now we have the foundations, how this CAN bus works. Now we get to gain access to this physical CAN bus inside the car. Maybe the most convenient way is to find just a repair manual or a wiring diagram of the car. They're usually available for garages. For Volkswagen, you can get them online. If you claim you are a garage, then you can buy it. Otherwise, you have to find it out by yourself, but this can become very, very hard. So we recommend having such a wiring diagram. Based on this wiring diagram, you can find a good exposed position of an interesting CAN bus where you can connect to. For example, here you can see the Tesla Model 3, which is in the mid console of the car. There's one of 3 CAN buses, which you can easily open and connect to a ready-to-buy adapter. You can buy those adapters easily on eBay, for example. And then you can gain access to this CAN bus. If you don't want to destroy your car or altering this, there are also less intrusive techniques called contactless CAN readers. They read CAN messages based on induction of the signal. And that's more or less, it looks like a crocodile. That's why some products called CAN crocodile. You clamp the CAN wires, high and low, those dual wires, between the clamp of the contactless CAN reader, and you can read those messages. So you have gained access to the physical layer. You have read those physical signals of the CAN bus. Now you have to transfer them into software, and therefore you need such an, for example, for the Raspberry Pi, for example, a CAN head, where those physical CAN signals are interpreted and transferred to the kernel of the Raspberry Pi. And there are also other options available which can conveniently used where you can connect your CAN bus directly via USB to your PC. This also works for Windows, so maybe it's for part of you interesting. So now we have transferred the message to the software part of our project, and that's where Tim continues.
All right. So very conveniently, in the Linux kernel, there's already a CAN driver built in. And if you want to work with that, there's CAN utils, which has all the basic tools to use that. Also, if you want to do more advanced stuff for scripting, you can use, for example, Python CAN as a really good library. That's what we use for our project. There's also CAN tools for more advanced command line tools. If you're into GUIs, there's SavvyCAN, which is a really good open source GUI tool. And of course, there are a lot of commercial tools. We talked about all this vector stuff before. But let's stick with the very basics. So you install CAN utils, and then there's this CAN dump command, which will just print out all of the CAN messages on the bus. It looks somehow like this, but probably a lot faster if you're on a real car. So for Tesla, for example, it might be on one bus, it's, I think, like 3,000 messages a second, so it can be quite a lot. One step back, even, if you connect to this. So for Linux, it's a CAN interface is like any other network interface, if your adapter is compatible with socket CAN. So the only difference is that you don't have network manager to directly get your interface up and running, and you also need a bit rate. So you have to tell the computer how fast the bus operates. And you can measure that by using an oscilloscope, of course. Luckily for automotive, it's usually 500 kilobits per second, so you can also try that. And just as a disclaimer, there are also like more modern standards, like improvements on the CAN standards, for example, CAN-FD. And there you will also need to have the data rate, for example. But let's assume standard CAN for now. And then we already seen the CAN-dump command. I just want to walk very quickly through what you can see here. That's one single message picked out. You see the interface in the front. If you have multiple CAN interfaces connected, that's important. Then the CAN ID and the data length and the data. And the thing is, this CAN ID, if you are used to IP, you're usually used to having like a source and a destination address. The CAN ID is actually neither. Think of it more like a publish-subscribe topic. So it will tell you how to define or how to interpret the bits like in the data part. Also, it's the priority of the message. So the lower the ID, the higher the priority. And these data, it can be really arbitrarily defined. The information in there is called signals, and it can be like 1 bit, it can be 5 bit, it can be all 8 bytes. So that's up to the manufacturer to define that, and that's why we usually need some reverse engineering to make sense of this information. Okay, so if you might want to get started, but maybe you do not want to like remove all the plating of your car, and it sounds very like a lot of work to figure out all the wiring and stuff. So that's actually how we started, but if you don't want to do that, there's also the way the garages do that. So Yannis already spoiled it, that you have this OBD2 connector and for vehicle diagnostics. And this connector is usually very conveniently located somewhere in the driver area of your vehicle in front, and you can just plug in a diagnostic connector there. It's usually an OBD2 dongle, which connects via Bluetooth to a diagnostic device and will read out data like that. And the protocol to do this is called UDS, Unified Diagnostic Services. And it's basically a request-response protocol. The diagnostic tester will, for example, in our case, we want the steering wheel angle, so it will ask the ECU responsible for that, can you give me the steering wheel angle, and it will respond with the correct value. So that's on top of the CAN protocol. It can also be IP, but usually CAN, and or both. And in between, there's actually another protocol, which is called ISOTP, and which allows to basically combine multiple CAN matches. They are limited to 8 byte to like one message in UDS, so you can send longer data. But that comes with like the difference that now we also I told you before that it's not like source and destination address, the CAN ID, but for UDS it's basically it's actually the destination address now. So there's also, if you want to read data, there's also a data identifier which identifies which data it is. So you can have now multiple like different interpretations for data with the same CAN ID, and data can be split over multiple CAN frames. Just watch out for that. All right, and with that, I think we should have everything ready to go.
Yeah, I think so. We have considered the physical layer, we have considered the transfer to the software, we have considered how we can interpret those CAN messages. So we have all together to create our game. And as a small in-between motivation, that's the actual result. Here you can see Tim sitting in our Volkswagen ID3. In front, we have placed a big monitor playing Need for Speed Most Wanted from 2008 with the actual car. Thank you. Here you can see a little bit more of our V2G experience. On left side, you can see our setup, a laptop where the game is actually running. In front of the car, we have placed a huge monitor for a very immersive experience for the driver, but also for all other people inside the car. On the right side, you can see me playing, again, Need for Speed Most Wanted. And you can see I'm very focused on this game. So, as I said, it's very immersive and it's a very cool experience sitting in such an equipped car. But how can we now connect the laptop, the game, with the car? You can see on the right the topology again. And therefore, we have several possibilities to connect the car. First, we can use wires. We can use the USB-based Pecan Pro, for example, connecting as one possibility to the internal CAN bus. And therefore, we have to figure out which CAN bus relevant messages are located on. We have to find the relevant messages, figuring out the relevant signals of the CAN message, as Tim already explained. And there's an overwhelming number of CAN messages on this internal bus. As Tim said, several thousands per second. So it's quite difficult to figuring this stuff out. Also, the whole breakout box stuff we've shown to you is required to get access to those internal buses. So the more convenient solution is connecting directly to the OBD2 port and use the diagnostic services for polling those informations and getting conveniently just the requested information. But since we live in 2024, wires are a little bit outdated. We have created a Raspberry Pi head, which allows us to emulate an Xbox 360 controller with a Raspberry Pi Zero, connecting directly to the OBD2 port of the car. And this Raspberry Pi connects via Bluetooth to the laptop, emulates this controller, and the laptop can stand outside the car and runs the game. There we use, for this setup, we use UDS. Now, a little bit into detail of the actual hardware we use for the lower layer of this. You can see it's a classical Raspberry Pi Zero with no modifications. Above that, we have located the Raspberry Pi CAN head, which is responsible for converting those physical CAN signals to a software-readable CAN message. And the top layer, we have created a self-designed PCB for connecting to this OBD2 port, and for this OBD2 port of the car. This OBD2 port, from this OBD2 port, we only use 4 connections: the 12 volt, the ground, the CAN high and CAN low connection. The CAN high and CAN low connection is directly transferred via this PCB to the lowered CAN head, which converts this message. But the more interesting part of this PCB is the 12 volt, 5 volt DC-DC conversion. So we can very conveniently connect this dongle to our car without the requirement for a power bank and power supply of the Raspberry Pi. As a short disclaimer, we are no electrical engineers, so if you have any recommendation about this, feel free to contact us. We are quite happy about recommendations. This circuit for 12 volt, 5 volt DC-DC conversion is just taken out of the data sheet of the used IC. Feel free to come off stage to us and discuss it with me. We have also added the possibility to add status LEDs, but that's to be done. They are connected to the GPIO pins of the Raspberry Pi, so you can, if you want to extend the project, you can use them for your own purpose. So we have the hardware, now the software.
Yeah, I'm just going very briefly over the software architecture of our tool. So if you want to use it in the Bluetooth mode as a Bluetooth controller, there's an install script for that. You just run it on your pre-imaged Raspberry Pi, and it will set up everything which is required. If you don't want to do it and just run it on your own laptop, there's a run script for Linux. For Windows, you just directly run the Python protocol. The run script actually will also set up some interfaces and stuff, but you can do this beforehand if you do not want to execute it with sudo privileges, because that's required for interface management. Then for emulating the game controller, for the Bluetooth version, we use the HitPy project to emulate a Bluetooth hit device. And if you run it on your own laptop, we use the vGamepad library, which is also cross-platform, so it also runs on Windows. You can also use that. For the Bluetooth one, it kind of doesn't really work on Windows so far. So if you have any recommendations on that and are an expert on hit devices, pull requests are welcome. So now to our actual the main components. We have a car detector. If you have multiple vehicles, as we have the ID3 and the Tesla, you can give it basically a list of CAN IDs, and it will figure out which car it is, and then use the according configuration. The heart of our project is the car connector, which will use convert all the CAN signals in the messages to triggers for the Xbox emulation. And then there is the vehicle configuration, which has all the vehicle-specific stuff in there. And I'll just have a more detailed look on that. So there you can configure a name for your vehicle to reference it. Then you have to specify which operation mode, if you want to use the internal mode or the UDS mode. Sometimes if you have an older car where there's no gateway in between the internal buses and the OBD2 connector, you can also use the internal mode for that. Or if you install like the OBD2 adapter for the Tesla. Otherwise, for the UDS mode, you will also have what you can see on the right side. You will have to send those polling messages I talked about earlier. Basically, you can just paste them in here, and it will periodically send them to get the data. There's also an update interval. So we have a higher interval for like the steering angle and brakes.
For example,
and for the buttons, we
you
use
may ask it some
a lower.
medical questions like, why do I have a rash on my back? All right? And ChatGPT will get back to you and say, oh, I'm sorry to hear you have a rash on your back. Let me give some tips how to take care of that. Or maybe you may ask ChatGPT for some relationship advice. What are the signs my wife is having an affair, right? And get some good tips on there. Or maybe you're getting into hacking and you're going to ask ChatGPT how to get into your neighbor's Wi-Fi, right? Lots of good use cases. Or my favorite, a lot of people are using ChatGPT to edit their documents. They'll take whole documents or emails, dump it into ChatGPT and say, hey, make it better, or finish this paragraph, or what have you. And these are all very good and legitimate use cases. They're actually very productive for our society to help us progress and automate things. But the problem is that what happens if these chats aren't actually private? What happens if somebody could read these chats beyond, for example, OpenAI? Right, so this would be a huge breach in privacy. So in truth, we know they're encrypted, right? So OpenAI is encrypting all the traffic going between the client and the servers. But is that enough? Maybe a little foreshadowing. So let me go back to the beginning of this story here. So several months ago, late at night, I was using ChatGPT for very important stuff, such as trying to figure out, what would the world be like if the every country had ninjas, but Japan had the worst ninjas, right? So as I'm looking at the text glide across the screen and looking at this very insightful and thoughtful response, it kind of hits me. Wait a second. Could it possibly be that OpenAI is sending every single word as a separate packet? And could it be that every single packet has no padding, so I can count the number of characters in each of these words? So I open up Wireshark, and sure enough, what do I see? For every single word that's being sent from the AI assistant, I see another packet, and the size of that packet increases. And if I take the delta between these packets, I know exactly how many characters in every single word. And I could use this, for example, to try and guess what those words are and potentially learn or identify what is being said in those responses. Now, before I go on to explain how we figured out what those words are, I need to take a little bit of a technical aside and clarify something. That what ChatGPT and all these different AI services are sending are not exactly words, but rather something called tokens. What tokens are basically the basic building block of AI language models. When you give text to a language model, it's going to first parse it down into these tokens, and then each token goes to the model, and then the model generates text using these tokens as well. So in general, these tokens more or less correlate directly to words, but there are some cases where these tokens won't. So for example, here, Llama's tokenizer will split the word cream into 2 separate tokens. But what's important to note is that although there's not a direct correlation from token to word, these tokenizers are public information. Doesn't matter if it's OpenAI's, if it's Meta's, you go through the entire list, you can get the tokenizer and you can learn the exact mappings. So for all intents and purposes, these are words, and we're trying to guess what these words are. So what's the threat model? So the victim types some private chat into his web browser, hits enter, and that encrypted text goes across the wire. Now, we're not going to be able to figure out what that prompt was, because that's just one big block of encrypted text. But what happens after that is the AI assistant starts responding token by token by token back, and we can count exactly how many characters are in each of these tokens. And once again, if we can guess what those words are, then boom, we know exactly what the response was. So why do we care? I mean, I can't figure out what the prompt was. I can't figure out what the exact question was.
42 beyond bug. One of them tweeted, I think yesterday, that just seeing the first bloods they were getting on the scoreboard made all the sleepless nights worth it. And so
receiving, and it said, "I'm sorry to hear that you have a rash." Right? I think it's pretty clear we know exactly what that user was asking for. So basically, this boils down to a big Wheel of Fortune game, right? Where I have to start guessing what those words are. And this can be a particularly challenging problem because, there's many different ways you can solve this puzzle.
All you need is fuzzing brain.
It gets even more challenging when you think about real responses from these AI assistants, right? They're not just one sentence, they're typically whole paragraphs with hundreds of words. So how do we solve this problem? So we turn to the age-old solution, which is AI. And we look towards a task which is very popular, which is language translation, right? But here, instead of going from a language such as French to English, we're going to go from token length sequences to plain text English. And what we'll do is we'll train an AI with lots and lots of examples of these token lengths to real English, and we'll be able to translate them very effectively.
So thank you for that.
In our case, we used a state-of-the-art model called a large language model, or LLM. And this is the exact same technology that's being used in AI assistants such as ChatGPT. I'm not going to go too much into detail how it works. Leave that for other YouTube videos. All right, so what's the entire attack end-to-end? How does it look like? So the attacker is looking through the network, looking for responses from a particular AI service, such as ChatGPT, sees the traffic going across the network, and records down the token length sequence from those packets. He then passes that token length sequence to his trained model, which has seen lots and lots of examples, and it predicts what it thinks the original plain text was. So there's something else we can do to make this even better. So if we just give our model random arbitrary text, it's going to do so-so. It's not going to do so great because, as I said, there's lots of ways we can solve that puzzle. But as it turns out, AI assistants have a very specific style of speaking, right? They're not just going to respond with some arbitrary sentence. They typically start with something like, "Oh, sure, yeah, I can give you a recipe for tomato soup," right? So there's a certain style that's intrinsically in those responses. So what I can do is, let's say I'm trying to target Microsoft Copilot, I can send lots and lots of prompts to Microsoft Copilot and build a huge data set of responses. And those responses capture the style of that particular AI service. And once I have that, I can fine-tune my model.
Your judicious
much
use of
better
the
results.
LLMs was also
And
appreciated.
as it turns out, I can get something around 55% attack success rate. So more than half of the responses that we see in the encrypted traffic, we can decipher.
To get
so let's look at some examples.
About talking about
so on the
automotive
screen here is the first sentences that we're trying to decipher. The first line is the original text that is being sent from the AI assistant, and the second line is our prediction. So sometimes you can see in the first example there, we get it right on the first go, and sometimes we make some mistakes. So for example, in the bottom there, the original response was, yes, there are several important legal considerations that couples should be aware of when considering a divorce. And then, if we look at the third response, we got, yes, there are several potential legal considerations that someone should be aware of when considering a divorce. So even though we had some mistakes in the words, it's very, very clear what was the topic and that the user was trying to ask the AI assistant. And then if we move over to entire paragraphs, we get something around a 35% attack success rate, which is also very significant, considering how hard it is to try and guess what all these words are. And since we're using AI models, this isn't a perfect science. We're using a lot of heuristics here, so we sometimes get it wrong. So here's some fails. So in the ground truth, it was something like, I would like to suggest some following strategies for team leaders to balance the needs of individual team members with the needs of the team as a whole. And we inferred it as, I would suggest the following strategies, so far so good, but then for film studios to balance the needs of production, so on and so forth, something that's completely unrelated. And sometimes it gets even worse, right? So here's a case where the response had something to do with apple cider, and we thought it had to do with coral bleaching. Okay, so it's not a perfect science, but what's interesting to note is that because we're using machine learning model, the model also gives us a confidence score. How confident it is that this prediction is correct, right? So what we can do is we can look, and we're trying to attack a particular token-linked sequence that we see in the network, we can try to look at the confidence of the model and say whether or not we should trust this inference or not. All right, so how common is this vulnerability? So, around the time of our disclosure, or prior to our disclosure, around February 2024, nearly every major AI vendor out there had this vulnerability. And when you start wondering, why is that the case? How did they overlook this seemingly obvious side channel? And there's a few reasons that might come to mind. First, perhaps they didn't think that token links are the same as word links, so maybe there was just a simple blunder. Or maybe they thought there's no way that an adversary can guess entire paragraphs of text. That's just too hard of a problem. But what I think is more likely the case is that it has something to do with the big AI gold rush, right? There's so many industries that are jumping on the AI chatbot idea and throwing it into services willy-nilly, and they're not really thinking about security by design. They're saying, the text is encrypted, not a big deal, let's move on, right? So this is probably more likely what happened there until they, of course, patched it after the fact. So why are they even sending, text streaming or token streaming across the network? Why don't they just send it as one big batch, right? So for example, Google's Gemini does this already. When you get a response from Google Gemini, it's not sending a token, it sends it as one big block, and therefore they're not vulnerable to this side channel attack. So why aren't the other vendors doing this? So there's a simple answer for that. And the answer is that these AI models are actually incredibly complex, and it takes a lot of effort to execute them. So instead of having the user wait there for a good 30 seconds for this loading screen to go by to get their response, it makes perfect sense to send those words or tokens one at a time in real time, so they can read it as it's being generated. All right, so to recap so far, what we've accomplished here is that we've discovered a novel side channel attack, which we call the token linked side channel. And we found it's common in LLM services all over. And we've also found a way to exploit that side channel, to read the hidden information behind it directly using AI, and improve that performance using a known plain text attack. Okay, so for the rest of this talk, we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty details. And first, we're going to talk about how we identified response traffic inside network traffic, and how we then extract the token length sequences from there. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about how we train AI models and our specific RAI model. And finally, we'll end off with some demos, defenses, and we'll talk about some bug bounties that we got along the way. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Daniel, who's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Israel. So let's jump to the nitty-gritty details. So we will talk about how to find the sign channel and how to extract the token length sequence. So the first thing we'll have to do is to capture the traffic containing the response from the AI assistant. So we'll need to be positioned between the victim and the AI assistant. Or we can be in the same local network as the victim, for example, sitting in the same cafe using Wi-Fi. So we collected a lot of traffic, and not all of it containing our response data from the AI assistant. So we'll need to filter the traffic. We can do that by filtering by the IP address of the AI assistant. That information can be collected by OSINT, or by connecting as a legitimate client to the AI assistant server through different times a day, from different locations, and making our own data set of those IP addresses, and basically filtering by those. Also, what we can do is filter by the protocol. So every vendor is using different protocol. For example, ChatGPT is using Quick protocol. So we would like to search for UDP packets that are coming from port 443. And again, every vendor is using different protocol, so we'll need to account for that. And also, there is a slight problem because it will add us more complexity when we will try to extract the token length sequence. Because again, every protocol looks differently on the wire and it has its own metadata. So we captured the traffic. We filtered out most of the traffic that don't contain our tokens. We have the traffic that contains the response from the AI assistant. Let's extract the token length sequence. So our objective is to find the token lengths. We need to remember that the traffic is encrypted, so we can't really see where are the tokens and what packets contain them. But what we can see is the bandwidth patterns, basically the packet sizes.
And there you will also need to have the data rate, for example. But let's assume standard CAN for now. And then we already seen the CAN up command. I just want to walk very quickly through what you can see here. That's one single message picked out. You see the interface in the front. If you have multiple CAN interfaces connected, that's important. Then the CAN ID and the data length and the data. And the thing is, this CAN ID, if you are used to IP, you're usually used to having like a source and a destination address. The CAN ID is actually neither. Think of it more like a publish-subscribe topic. So it will tell you how to define or how to interpret the bits like in the data part. Also, it's the priority of the message. So the lower the ID, the higher the priority. And these data, it can be really arbitrarily defined. The information in there is called signals. And it can be like 1 bit, it can be 5 bit, it can be all 8 bytes. So that's up to the manufacturer to define that. And that's why we usually need some reverse engineering to make sense of this information. OK, so if you might want to get started, but maybe you do not want to like remove all the plating of your car. And it sounds very like a lot of work to figure out all the wiring and stuff. So that's actually how we started, but if you don't want to do that, there's also the way the garages do that. So Yannis already spoiled it, that you have this OBD2 connector and for vehicle diagnostics. And this connector is usually very conveniently located somewhere in the driver area of your vehicle in front, and you can just plug in a diagnostic connector there. It's usually an OBD2 dongle, which connects via Bluetooth to a diagnostic device. And will read out data like that. And the protocol to do this is called UDS, Unified Diagnostic Services. And it's basically a request-response protocol. The diagnostic tester will, for example, in our case, we want the steering wheel angle, so it will ask the ECU responsible for that, can you give me the steering wheel angle, and it will respond with the correct value. So that's on top of the CAN protocol. It can also be IP, but usually CAN, and or both. And in between, there's actually another protocol, which is called ISOTP, and which allows to basically combine multiple CAN matches. They are limited to 8 byte to like one message in UDS, so you can send longer data. But that comes with like the difference that now we also, I told you before that it's not like source and destination address, the CAN ID, but for UDS it's basically, it's actually the destination address now. So there's also, if you want to read data, there's also a data identifier which identifies which data it is. So you can have now multiple, like different interpretations for data with the same CAN ID, and data can be split over multiple CAN frames. Just watch out for that. All right, and with that, I think we should have everything ready to go.
Yeah, I think so. We have considered the physical layer, we have considered the transfer to the software, we have considered how we can interpret those CAN messages, so we have all together to create our game. And as a small in-between motivation, that's the actual result. Here you can see Tim sitting in our Volkswagen ID3. In front we have placed a big monitor playing Need for Speed Most Wanted from 2008 with the actual car. Thank you. Here you can see a little bit more of our V2G experience. On left side you can see our setup, a laptop where the game is actually running. In front of the car we have placed a huge monitor for very immersive experience for the driver, but also for all other people inside the car. On the right side you can see me playing, again, Need for Speed Most Wanted. And you can see I'm very focused on this game. So, as I said, it's very immersive and it's a very cool experience sitting in such an equipped car. But how can we now connect the laptop, the game, with the car? You can see on the right the topology again, and therefore we have several possibilities to connect the car. First, we can use wires. We can use the USB-based PCAN Pro, for example, connecting as one possibility to the internal CAN bus. And therefore, we have to figure out which CAN bus relevant messages are located on. We have to find the relevant messages, figuring out the relevant signals of the CAN message, as Tim already explained. And there's an overwhelming number of CAN messages on this internal bus. As Tim said, several thousands per second. So it's quite difficult to figuring this stuff out. Also, the whole breakout box stuff we've shown to you is required to get access to those internal buses. So the more convenient solution is connecting directly to the OBD2 port and use the diagnostic services for polling those informations and getting conveniently just the requested information. But since we live in 2024, wires are a little bit outdated. We have created a Raspberry Pi head, which allows us to emulate an Xbox 360 controller with a Raspberry Pi Zero, connecting directly to the OBD2 port of the car. And this Raspberry Pi connects via Bluetooth to the laptop, emulates this controller, and the laptop can stand outside the car and runs the game. There we use, for this setup, we use UDS. Now, a little bit into detail of the actual hardware we use for the lower layer of this. You can see it's a classical Raspberry Pi Zero with no modifications. Above that, we have located the Raspberry Pi CAN head, which is responsible for converting those physical CAN signals to a software-readable CAN message. And the top layer, we have created a self-designed PCB for connecting to this OBD2 port, and for this OBD2 port of the car. This OBD2 port, from this OBD2 port, we only use 4 connections: the 12 volt, the ground, the CAN high and CAN low connection. The CAN high and CAN low connection is directly transferred via this PCB to the lowered CAN head, which converts this message. But the more interesting part of this PCB is the 12 volt, 5 volt DC-DC conversion. So we can very conveniently connect this dongle to our car without the requirement for a power bank and power supply of the Raspberry Pi. As a short disclaimer, we are no electrical engineers, so if you have any recommendation about this, feel free to contact us. We are quite happy about recommendations. This circuit for 12 volt, 5 volt DC-DC conversion is just taken out of the data sheet of the used IC. Feel free to come off stage to us and discuss it with me. We've also added the possibility to add status LEDs, but that's to be done. You can, they are connected to the GPIO pins of the Raspberry Pi, so you can, if you want to extend the project, you can use them for your own purpose. So we have the hardware, now the software.
Yeah, I'm just going very briefly over the software architecture of our tool. So if you want to use it in the Bluetooth mode, as a Bluetooth controller, there's an install script for that. You just run it on your pre-imaged Raspberry Pi, and you will set up everything which is required. If you don't want to do it and just run it on your own laptop, there's a run script for Linux. For Windows, you just directly run the Python protocol. The run script actually will also set up some interfaces and stuff, but you can do this beforehand if you do not want to execute it with sudo privileges, because that's required for interface management. Then for emulating the game controller, for the Bluetooth version, we use the HitPy project to emulate a Bluetooth device, and if you run it on your own laptop, we use the vGamepad library, which is also cross-platform, so it also runs on Windows. You can also use that. For the Bluetooth one, it kind of doesn't really work on Windows so far, so if you have any recommendations on that and are an expert on hit devices, pull requests are welcome. So now to our actual, the main components. We have a car detector. If you have multiple vehicles, as we have the ID3 and the Tesla, you can give it basically a list of CAN IDs, and it will figure out which car it is, and then use the according configuration. The heart of our project is the car connector, which will use convert all the CAN signals in the messages to triggers for the Xbox emulation. And then there is the vehicle configuration, which has all the vehicle-specific stuff in there. And I'll just have a more detailed look on that. So there you can configure a name for your vehicle to reference it. Then you have to specify which operation mode, if you want to use the internal mode or the UDS mode. Sometimes you actually, if you have an older car where there's no gateway in between the internal buses and the OBD2 connector, you can also use the internal mode for that. Or if you install the OBD2 adapter for the Tesla. Otherwise, for the UDS mode, you will also have what you can see on the right side, and you will have to send those polling messages I talked about earlier. Basically, you can just paste them in here, and it will periodically send them to get the data. There's also an update interval, so we have a higher interval for the steering angle and brakes, and for the buttons we use a lower update interval because there's a limit how fast the ECUs will respond. Also, we have there you can see the auto detect IDs I mentioned before, and also we have some high-level configuration stuff. For example, there's we limit the steering, because if you play a racing game and you have to 2 times turn the wheel for the maximum steering, it's just too slow, right? And also there's the steering dead zone, which basically you have a bit more space to set your steering wheel to 0, because otherwise if it's 0.01 degrees, and it will always go left in the menus, or you just cannot drive straight. It's actually pretty hard to get your steering wheel to exactly 0 degrees, so that's pretty handy. I'll go a bit into detail on the signal configuration later. But for now, let's look at how it works out.
Yeah, we are ready to play. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to bring our car with us, so we've brought some videos of the gaming experience. You can see me here driving filmed with a first-person view, playing Super Tux Kart. You can see I control the racing car with the steering wheel, left and right. And now I've paused because you can see I put my foot on the brake. And see what happens next. As expected, the racing car brakes, slows down, and I was overtaken. Now you can see I've started the indicator. We have mapped the indicator function for left to throwing items in this game. You can do this for your own purpose, for your own game, but we have mapped it like this. So you can see here, I'm throwing this exploding muffin to the racing car in front of me, so it will explode. Unfortunately, because of PowerPoint is a little bit annoying, sometimes, usually you should see that I have turned on the full beam flash, full beam 2. So we have mapped the full beam trigger to the nitro activation in the game.
In this room today,
so it's very cool, driving the night, igniting, and the car
so
speeds
I'm going
up.
to tell you the bad news first, and
See
that's
what
the
happened? Yeah,
speaker
there
has
you can see the
so,
nitrogen. Now,
I know,
you can
right?
see it's a little bit difficult to drive,
if I could find him and drag him in here
beforehand,
kicking and screaming,
but
you know
it's
I'd do
possible
it for
to
y'all, right?
race, it is possible
Love
to
y'all, but,
overtook enemies in this game, and it
that's
is
not gonna
also
happen.
possible
So
to get
the room does
the
have a little bit of
right
music.
items. In this example,
You can hang out a minute and
acceleration
listen
one.
to. Otherwise, you're welcome to
win racing games.
vacate the room. Now, if you do that, I'd like you to do it in an orderly fashion so I don't have a bunch of goons yelling at you and everything. Okay?
And it's actually a lot of fun.
That's
so.
great.
You see, we're very
All right,
excited about
I
this.
know. Grumble, grumble.
So,
love you guys.
Yeah, so the question all of you probably have in your mind, how do you support your own car to use this? Well, before you get started on that, just make sure you keep in mind the safety. So make sure you cannot accidentally drive into a wall, right? Because if you're in your garage and like you're really into your game and by accident you switch to drive mode, you don't want to do that happen. Even if, yeah, you're probably like hard on the gas, right? So make sure you cannot do that. Of course, that's less a problem on combustion engine vehicles where you do not have to turn on the engine, but then make sure not to drain your 12-volt battery, like playing all night, and yeah, that's probably not good if you do not have like a charger connected. So what do you need? I think we talked about everything of that. The Raspberry Pi, a CAN head. You can also use just an OBD2 open-ended cable if you do not want to solder your own OBD2 head. So that all should be less than $50, I think, to get started. If you use the diagnostic mode and you have to get a diagnostic tester to reverse engineer that really depends on the car probably. There are sometimes some very cheap ones, and if you have to get a garage level one, it's pretty expensive, so yeah, probably too much. Okay, and then you can start reverse engineering. So here you can see the UDS tester setup basically. The actuator, we are looking at the steering wheel angle as before. Here we have a tablet with the diagnostic tool, which reads out the steering angle. And here we have my laptop, which runs CAN Sniffer, which is a very convenient tool to show you the differences in CAN messages. And what we'll do next is turn the steering wheel to see where the information is. And actually, I turn it one time completely to the left and one time to the right to get a min and maximum value, which is possible for the signal, but you have seen where it is located. And yeah, sometimes you're lucky and you will find already complete CAN database files, those called DBC files, online for your car. Then you can also try to get this information out of there and use that. But otherwise, reverse engineering of this data is quite good because it's you can easily turn the steering wheel to see where the data is, right? It's just if there are 3,000 messages, it might be take you some time to find the right one. Then for configuring it, you basically add all this information, the CAN ID, the position in the signal, and the length of the data. And then that's why we use Python for the configuration. You can just use a function to specify the signal mapping. In this case, we have the first byte is going to the turning to the left, the second to the right, and then we specify the min and max value and map this to a range of -1.0 to 1.0. All right, that's what you need to configure it for your own car. So in conclusion of this talk, if anybody asks you, especially our professor, now you definitely know that V2G stands for vehicle to game.
And back doors and input handling.
Car hacking can be really fun, and I think our project is a great
I identified called incubated ML exploits that combine backdoors and input handling bugs. Don't worry if you don't know too much about ML or ML security. I'll explain all the important stuff as we go along. So who am I and why am I even talking to you today? I'm an engineer at Trail of Bits, where I focus on AI and ML security. I've been in the field for a few years now. I graduated from Georgia Tech, and I'm originally from Queens. Outside of work, I like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, trying new restaurants, making things, and an obscure card game called Q-Birds. So it's becoming pretty clear with ML and AI popping up everywhere, people are figuring out how to trick these systems based on how these models work. Maybe you've seen someone use prompt injection to convince a chatbot to give them a refund. Or maybe you've seen this story right here of protesters tricking self-driving cars with traffic cones. Notice the fact that this trick is rooted in an understanding of the training data for these models. So how can we actually construct our own useful exploits against ML systems? Let's play a game of pretend real quick. You're a college student, and you really, really want the prize money for a robotics competition. So naturally, you decide to sabotage another team. Side note, I don't recommend this. I don't condone this. I've never done it myself. But anyway, the competition requires teams to build a tiny autonomous vehicle that uses a specific pre-trained model and stops at stop signs. So you find out that some of these stop signs have these little stickers on them. And you also find some flaws with how they've stored and distributed the model, which, by the way, isn't out of the question. ML artifacts are often widely shared without any meaningful or substantial trust mechanisms. So you decide to grab that file and inject a model backdoor in it using a file format RCE of some kind, and then you put it back. Then on the day of the competition, you sit back and you just watch as your competitor's vehicle just plows through and ignores every stop sign with a sticker on it. What you just did is execute an incubated ML exploit, which is what my talk is all about. So obviously the stakes of this story is just a lost robotics competition. But the idea of attacking a real autonomous vehicle is a hallmark of model backdoor research. And you can see that with the image on the left. So I'll let you use your imagination to raise the stakes. So in my talk, first I'm going to tell you about this framework that I've been using to bridge the gap between model and system security, because we can't continue to treat models as standalone objects. Next, I'll tell you about these input handling bugs I found in model serialization and connect them to backdoors. I'll do that by taking a page out of this subfield called langsec. So effectively, I'll be going through a bunch of examples of incubated ML exploits and use langsec to organize them. But first, I need to explain some stuff. What even is a model vulnerability or an ML backdoor? So super briefly, you can think of ML models as these squishy, flexible sequences of linear algebra operations that are trained on tons and tons of data. There's a pretty popular saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We're just saying that these models aren't perfect. There are many different ways they can mess up or get tripped up by something that might be unexpected to us. And that's the basis of such model vulnerabilities. While popular examples of model vulnerabilities include model inversion and membership inference, we're zooming in on one specific type, model backdoors. So to be precise about it, a backdoor attack allows a malicious actor to force an ML model to produce specific outputs given specific inputs. Now, there's a couple of things that I think make backdoors really interesting to study. First up, you can use them as primitives for other model vulnerabilities, like membership inference. You can also identify pre-existing, quote-unquote, natural backdoors in them. And there's also some pretty strong evidence that suggests that this is an inherent threat. Now, while there's a lot of awesome research on ML model attacks, they can actually be pretty hard to exploit in the real world, with some exceptions, of course. While there are multiple reasons for this, one thing that really sticks out to me is the big gap between research and the real world. So for the most part, many attacks and attack frameworks and tools restrict their analysis to this formulation. An ML model receives an input and produces an output. But this isn't an accurate representation of what an ML system actually looks like. There's so much more going on in practice. Here's a software architecture diagram for an ML system reviewed by Trail of Bits recently. This is a system that uses the Ask Astro tool for RAG. And I've circled where the model actually is in this photo. Do you see what I mean? We need to be looking at all of this holistically. There's a large and evolving landscape of tools being used in and for ML systems. And that brings me to the exploit framework. So the title of my talk references an incubated ML exploit. But there's this larger category of exploits that, called hybrid ML exploits that are important to think about first. Specifically, a hybrid ML exploit chains a system security issue with a model vulnerability. This can go in either direction, and you can see that on the diagram. You can have a model vulnerability that exposes a system security issue, or you could use a system security issue to exploit a model vulnerability. So this part's pretty important. The big issue that I see with ML security is that model security and system security are treated separately. But what I need you to understand is that if you only know model security, you're missing a big piece. And if you're only covering system security, you're still missing a big piece. And if you're treating the two processes completely independently, once again, you're missing a big piece. You're then entirely ignoring the potential for hybrid ML exploits. This is an emergent property. So your model is embedded in a system, and it's going to interact with all of the different system components in new and exploitable ways. So one thing you'll notice is that there's a lot of screenshots of paper titles on this slide. That's because there have been specific instances of hybrid ML exploits in the literature and in practice. They're just not called that explicitly. Exploitable software gadgets have been used for backdoors. The Summoning Demons paper up there at the top chained model evasion and memory corruption. And the Learn System Security paper next to it has an example of a poisoning attack that caused an exponential memory blowup in an index structure. But the ML security literature, framework, and tools are largely limited to just that, specific instances or implications. What I'm trying to do here, what I want to be doing here, is treating this interaction explicitly and systematically. And that's why I made this framework. So one kind of system security issue is an input handling bug, and one kind of model vulnerability is a model backdoor. Put that together, and we get an incubated ML exploit, which is a type of hybrid ML exploit where an attacker uses an input handling bug to inject a backdoor. So I made this diagram to make the distinction between the two pretty clear. And here's the definition again. I'm going to leave the framework here for now. We did end up going into a bit of a more formal model of exploitation, including this exploit schema, but we'll return to that later. So to backdoor a pre-existing model, the attacker should be able to change the parameters or the architecture. Now, at the level of extraction we're dealing with, we can put input and component manipulation on the side for now, but how this actually plays out can vary a lot. For example, sometimes the attacker has control over some element of the training process, and they use that to sneak in some manipulated data that changes the model's parameters. That's usually called data poisoning. Or they might go a step further and fiddle with the model's source code to change the architecture. Now, before we talk about exploits, I want to explain a few things about input handling bugs. So an ML model is stored as a file. To process these models, you need parsers. And parsing these files into objects and back is deserialization and serialization. But wait, quoting Ange Albertini here, a file has So I'm focused very specifically on bugs that arise when you parse ML model files. There's also cool bugs in other parts of the pipeline, but I'm picking ML model files for several reasons. The first reason is, and I'm sure you all will agree with me on this, the most important. I think it's fun, but more seriously, the security of ML file formats has become increasingly important. real malicious model files have been found on the Hugging Face Hub, for example. And there's also just an absolute ton of ML file formats out there. I've tried to list and organize them in the repository in the middle, but what's important for you to take away is that there's a large set of possibilities for these exploits, as well as just fun hacks with these formats. And there's already a lot of great work in this area, as shown on my slide. So file format tricks are within the realm of LangSec, but this field actually thinks more abstractly about inputs as a general class. LangSec applies formal language theory to system security. It focuses on exploring input handling bugs or parser problems as a big root cause for security issues. After all, lots of impactful vulnerabilities like Heartbleed and Android Master Key have been parser bugs. Now, while I like formal language theory, this talk isn't theoretical computer science 101. So just know that fundamentally what LangSec is saying is, hey, let's treat all of the inputs as a specific language and make our code just capable enough to understand that language properly. So my work is centered around a specific taxonomy of input handling bugs. And these are all the different bug classes. There are 8 different types. Quick note, these categories aren't actually completely distinct from each other. The one you choose comes from a root cause analysis. So with the exception of one, I'm going to show you multiple examples of each in ML tools and use them to build an ML backdoor. So I'm going to run that one more time. In order to show that input handling bugs are a vector, I identified issues with ML model serialization across these different bug classes in order to construct ML backdoors. So now we can dive into the most fun part. Exploits. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus more on the useful gadgets for these exploits. So these are some characters that play important roles in the ML ecosystem that can help us understand the impact of these exploits. So Alice, she distributes models. She takes open source LLMs and fine-tunes them. The models she distributes are what everyone else in our story is going to be using. Bob is a frontline user who directly uses Alice's models in his own life. Maybe he has a nice chat interface pulled up. There's Dave. Dave is a developer who's trying to integrate these models into products. Frank is the end user who's relying on Dave's products in his daily life. He might be unaware of the ML models working behind the scenes. And now we have Chuck. Chuck is the attacker. Our focus here will mainly be on how Chuck can impact Bob and Dave. So I'll describe some exploits involving the file formats associated with Pickle, PyTorch, TorchScript, ONNX, and safe tensors. So this first category is called non-minimalist input handling code. It sounds a little fancy, but all it means is that the code used to check and parse these inputs is too complex, so an attacker can potentially grab the necessary gadgets for their exploits. So pickling is a serialization method that allows you to save arbitrary objects, and it's very, very common in the ML ecosystem. Recently, my coworker Boyan Milanov led the development of Sleepy Pickle, which is an incubated ML exploit. And what it does is it chains a pickle RCE with model backdoors. So on the right, you can see an LLM that has been backdoored to phish users. The blog post also has some examples of an LLM being used to spread misinformation and even steal user data. But what's cool about this exploit is that it can happen on the fly. So there's more room and possibilities for an attacker than just uploading a malicious model. So what do I mean by pickle RCE? Python pickles are compiled programs that run in a unique virtual machine called a pickle machine, or PM for short. The PM interprets the pickle file sequence of opcodes to construct an arbitrarily complex Python object. But it has 2 opcodes, global and reduce, that can execute arbitrary code outside of the PM, which makes it possible to construct malicious pickle data. Now, the underlying issue here is that the PM is more complex than something that's only parsing ML models should be. So way back in the year 2021, we released this tool called Fickling. This project was led by Evan Sultanic. To our knowledge, Fickling was the first pickle security tool tailored for ML use cases. It's a decompiler, static analyzer, and bytecode rewriter for Python Pickle. So it can help you detect, analyze, and even create malicious pickle files. So the reason it's safe to run on potentially malicious files is because it symbolically executes code using its own PM implementation. Relatively recently, I added a PyTorch module to it to make it easy to statically analyze and inject code into PyTorch files. But pickles are clearly bad for Bob. If Alice is distributing models as pickle files, that makes it that much easier for Chuck to inject a backdoor using a pickle RCE. So on to the next class. This term just means you shouldn't try to correct invalid input, reject it altogether. I've heard it referred to as the anti-robustness principle. So to deal with the issues with pickling, many devs write these things called restricted unpicklers. Now, those are some subclasses of unpickler that try to enforce an allow list or a block list. The thing is, they're actually not that hard to bypass. There's this methodology called pain pickle that demonstrates how to automatically bypass restricted unpicklers, which would enable arbitrary code execution and, to that end, backdoors. So they identified 8 different types of unpicklers and 3 strategies that work against the vast majority of them. So much like pickle was bad for Bob, restricted unpickling bypasses pose a problem for Dave if he relies on them in some fashion. Now we can talk about parser differentials. So this happens when different parsers in a system read the same input but interpret it differently. So when 2 parsers interpret the same file in different ways, that file is known as an ambiguous file. This is a very common exploit technique. It's pretty good for bypasses. It means you can create an ML model file that is benign for one system or system component, but backdoored for another. There's some more bigger implications for ML system exploitation here that we'll talk a bit more about later. But just a quick note, whether or not this is impactful at all depends on your system. So that's where you want to do threat modeling, of course. So we actually were able to create 2 differential proof of concepts with TorchScript. TorchScript is a popular format to store ML models in for a couple of reasons, mainly performance and portability. But you can make a parser differential with it and chain it to an architectural backdoor. So that's because you can turn a PyTorch model into a TorchScript one through tracing or scripting. And tracing doesn't incorporate dynamic control flow. So all you have to do is represent the malicious components for the backdoor with dynamic control flow. Now, the second example was found during the YOLO audit. Last year, my team and I audited a popular open source code base for computer vision called YOLO v7. They released standard versions of their model and torch-scripted versions for deployment. We noticed many cases where tracing didn't capture the model accurately. After serialization and deserialization, key information was lost, and the usual PyTorch warnings didn't show up. So to spot this differential, we used the TorchScript automatic trace checker, TorchFX, and the TorchScript IR. So with what we found, we created an input that made the 2 versions of the model act differently, effectively a backdoor attack. So once again, bad for Bob. He's getting a fundamentally different model than the one Alice trained, so this breaks any pre-existing promises. So we also identified a parser differential with safe tensors. Safe tensors is another file format for ML models developed in response to the insecurity of pickling. Last year, I was on an audit of the safe tensors library, where we identified the inclusion of JSON in the file format as a source of parser differentials. Now, JSON's pretty well known to be underspecified. There's a bunch of exploits in the web security world that leverage this. But the thing is, the reference safe tensors implementation, the main implementation, uses the CERD parser, which is good. It's strict. It rejects duplicate keys. But there's a bunch of external tools that use the Python built-in JSON parser, which doesn't. So you can use a duplicate key for the offsets to append backdoored weights and create manipulated safe tensors files that are rejected by the reference implementation, but accepted by external parsers. It has to be a weights-based backdoor because the weights in architecture are stored separately here, and there's a bit more details and caveats regarding the exploitability here, but just know the safe tensors parser differential is more impactful for Dave. He needs to make sure all the parsers in his product agree. If his tool is using a more permissive safe tensors parser than the reference implementation, it might just accept manipulated safe tensors files that have backdoored models. So one big part of my research is analyzing previous work and noticing trends. Now, I don't want to get too into the weeds here. I'd like to say formalisms for accompanying materials. But one thing that stuck out to me is that from parser differentials, we get these things called model differentials, instances where the same model is interpreted differently. As expected, this attack is dependent on the supply chain component and lifecycle stage. But in an ML system, you can pre-process inputs, or you can apply model transformations before you deploy a model. So some studies have exploited parser differentials right at the pre-processing stage. These are things like image scaling or Unicode parsing. And those attacks often change the weights. There have also been backdoor attacks that take advantage of model transformations like compilation or quantization, and those usually change the architecture. So I think it's very possible that most transformations can be encoded in a loss function, can result in an exploitable backdoor. But let's move forward from here. Next up, we have shotgun parsing. This is just what happens when you don't fully and properly check your input before beginning to process it. So let's talk about polyglot files. These are files that can be validly interpreted as 2 or more different formats. Polyglot files have been used to distribute malware, bypass code signing checks, and enable other malicious behaviors. So for ML model serialization, you can take these, put them in model hubs, and confuse some downstream consumers. But more importantly, you can have 2 different ML pipelines that interpret the same file as different models, so you can smuggle a backdoored model in with a benign one. So during our audit of the Safe Tensors library, we were able to make multiple polyglots. This includes zip, PDF, TF records, Keras native, and later on PyTorch MAR. And the Safe Tensors audit report itself is a PDF zip polyglot with a zip file containing all the polyglots we made during the audit. So you can just slap on a weights-based backdoored model to one of these formats to a benign Safe Tensors model, open it up with Safe Tensors, everything's fine, load it up with like PyTorch MAR or some other system, and boom, there's your backdoor. Now this is a real problem for folks like Dave, who's depending on these models, because now you've got malicious models sneaking in with benign ones, right? The reason this is possible is because of a missing check. Specifically, the program didn't check whether the start and end offsets corresponded with the tensor size, so attackers could append arbitrary data to the file. And that can be combined with the ability to change the header size to expand the number of polyglots. Now, this issue has since been fixed with Safe Tensors, however. So our next category is incomplete protocol specification. Just think of it as under specification for now. There are multiple examples of this in the literature, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about PyTorch polyglots. So many people are unaware that PyTorch actually supports multiple file formats. Some are deprecated, but still supported by external parsers. Now, one issue is that it does lack consistent versioning here. So it's not that difficult to create polyglots of files that can be validly interpreted as different types of PyTorch file formats. So same for ambiguous files, side note. So you can just like add 3 files to get a polymock between version 1.3 and TorchScript version 1.4. But a bigger issue is the reliance on zip and pickle. So pickle is a streaming file format. It ends once it reaches the stop code. So you can validly just append arbitrary data to it. Now, on the other hand, most zip parsers don't enforce their magic at the start. So you can prepend to it. And one example of this is PyTorch MAR. So you can append a zip to a pickle file to create a zip pickle polyglot. And that gives you some good PyTorch polyglots. So Fickling now has a polyglot module, so you can differentiate, identify, and create polyglots for the different PyTorch file formats. Now, on to the next class. This one just means your input should be simple and well-defined so you can check it thoroughly. Take ONNX. It's a protobuf-based way to store ML models. Adeline Travers discovered a neat hack for the ONNX runtime he packaged into a tool called Lobotomy. So ML runtimes and frameworks often let you add custom ops to a model on the fly. And the language used for the ONNX runtime custom ops at that point in time was complex. So even though the ONNX protobuf specification officially disallowed side effects, in the ONNX runtime, you can encapsulate arbitrary code into a custom op, and you can use that to launch an architectural backdoor attack. Just like Pickle, this is not good news for Bob. So to recap, Bob, our direct consumer, was affected by the Pickle, ONNX, and TorchScript issues. Dave, on the other hand, was affected by the PyTorch, Safe Tensors, and restricted unpickling issues. Now, what a lot of people miss is how important and how complex the ML stack is. The model you choose changes the technologies in the stack. So whenever I'm assessing a system or doing some kind of vulnerability research, I'm always trying to think about what layer of the ML stack I'm dealing with. So the layers I have listed here are hardware, infrastructure, low-level, compiler, high-level, framework, model, and knowledge. And I just described a bunch of exploits, right? So of the ones I told you about, the ones that are exposed and impactful at the framework level are the restricted unpickler, ONX runtime, and pickle exploits. Now, the compiler level corresponds to the torch script differential, and the safe tensors and PyTorch polyglot issues are impactful at the infrastructure level. And this is just a starting point. There's going to be exploits up and down this stack that impact ML systems. So if you want to get into attacking ML systems, this is a good place to start. Are you really, really good at breaking hardware? Go take a stab at a TPU. Do you happen to know a lot about distributed system security? Go write some hybrid ML exploits at the infrastructure level. So I made this schema for incubated ML exploits. This is just one piece of a more formal model of exploitation I worked on. I'm just going to talk about this at a very high level to shed some light on the terrain here. If you want to pull off an incubated ML exploit, you want write primitives for the weights or the architecture, right? And with the proof of concepts, we've seen some additional useful capabilities. So side note, you probably want read primitives as well. But with the safe tensors parser differential, you saw that access to the metadata could enable both kinds of attacks. And you also saw that there's a lot of utility in exploiting model transformations and model differentials. With that, you can construct exploits at different stages of the pipeline that exploit existing procedures. So with ONNX, it also became pretty obvious that you can use malicious custom ops in serialization formats, and potentially even in places like compiler dialects. I'll release more details on this in accompanying materials. But I do want to make some more explicit recommendations. I apologize for the busy slide here. Models should be checked for integrity, and their metadata should be well parsed. We want good trust mechanisms. We want proper validation. We want to minimize complexity, so we should be avoiding custom ops and separating the weights and architecture storage. I also think we should be doing a better job of following recommended practices for file formats, like they should have versions and checksums and magic signatures, and they should enforce the signature at offset 0. And we really need to invest in just more robust specifications and tooling. So I'm hoping we can see hybrid ML exploits and incubated ML exploits addressed by more frameworks and tools. I'd love to see this framework evolve and be applied to specific ML tools and contexts. I want to see it use more bug classes and more model vulnerabilities. I'd also like to see people investigate exploit persistence, reliability, and defense more. And just generally, I think there's so much interesting work to be done here with ML infrastructure security, with model differentials and file formats and specifications and even reverse engineering. But before we finish, what helps me identify and make progress on ML security problems is understanding these two root causes. First, we're building all of these new systems for ML. New hardware, new programming languages, new compilers, new file formats. There are conferences dedicated just to new ways to design ML infrastructure. And that means all of these new systems are introducing new attack surfaces. At the same time, it's becoming increasingly clear that the ML stack and supply chain have not been subject to sufficient review. That's why we're seeing pickles everywhere, right? Second, simply placing an ML model into a program introduces all of these new vulnerabilities that stem from how the model interacts with different components. ML is not a quick add-on, but something that can and will fundamentally change your system security posture. So I hope you leave this talk knowing that we need to concurrently and holistically think about system security and model
very
security.
Glad for us
I really
to
recommend
have you
checking
here.
out the full audit
Thanks
reports
the
for safe
La
tensors in
Villa
YOLO,
Hacker
as
people
well as the
that
blog
are here,
posts
I'm
on
sure,
pickling
because
and the
I
file formats repo.
cried for that. Yeah. And, well, we are prepared now to talk to you about railroad hacking. We got this. It's working? Not working? Okay. We are Gabriela Garcia and David Melendez. I am a security software developer that got into hacking and hardware hacking because of the hardware hacker people that they like to introduce you to the weird world. And David Melendez, I am the embedded software engineer that is here to talk to you, with me, about railroad hacking. We call this the dark territory because in railway sector, a dark territory is a section of the railway that lacks signals and you have no automatic blocking systems. So in this area, the communication and coordination is really exclusive on the railway operator, and the term has gained popularity in railway hackers to describe sectors that lack supervision in any other kind of way. So we are introducing you Fun with Trains. As you can see, graphic design is our passion. So let me introduce you to some concepts. For example, the railway block. A railway block is a section that is normally no more than one train can be present to evade collision between two trains. This block session can be between stations and can be between signals, for the railroad control people to be able to control the passes of the trains between these blocks. To know where and how they have been passing the trains, we have axle counters that are systems that count the axis of every train, and every train needs to be the same amount of axles in the first one and in the last one. It's nice because you don't lose people or half of your train, so it's very cool. And we can have train blockings in different ways. For example, we can give a token. It's vintage, but it's still happening in some parts of the world. You can give the railway operator token, and he takes it. It's vintage, okay? It takes it, and then you know that this train has passed through your station. The next technological advancement has been to call people instead of giving them a token, because it's weird. So the telephone block is just to tell the next block that the train is passing through your block. It's less vintage, but vintage too. And then we pass it to the train blocking, the electronic train blocking. What we have is slices of railway that are controlled by signals or controlled by a central control operation center that blocks the slice of railway when the train is passing out, taking into account the data received through the access counter. We have it in one track, we have two tracks, and we have reversible two tracks. So we can have control in every direction you have your train passing. The control is just set by the side where these beacons in the railway are set. So if you are in one direction, the beacon that is controlling you is in the right side of the railway. And if you are in the opposite direction, in your direction there will be another beacon controlling that you are passing through this segment. And this is the centralized traffic control. This is especially in Madrid, called Chamartín. And there are like lots of people working here controlling that the trains don't collide, especially. We have based this investigation in one of the systems that is present in Spain that is called ASFA. In Spanish is Anuncio de Señales y Frenado Automático. In English, Announcement of Signal and Automatic Braking. What it does is support the train circulation based on a core capacitor circuit connected to a signal, and depending the signal, the aspect they need to transmit one frequency or another in the onboard equipment. So this is the whole process. You have a railway signal that connects to a unit that gives a signal to a beacon. The beacon is received by the perturbation, is the name? The perturbation is received by the antenna, And this antenna gives a signal to a console that is inside the train and gives different aspects related to different signs. The first of all is that you can have fixed aspects that are signals or beacons that only transmit one signal, and variable aspects that have beacons that have different signals. And it depends on the frequency they leave the antenna is the aspect that the railway operator is receiving inside. So the first problem is that, as you can see, a couple of different signals give different aspects, or the same range of frequencies give different signals to the railway operator. So, for example, the L1 and the L3 are in the same range of frequencies, so we can have little problems when we are not controlling it as much as we need. And this is the panel that the operator receives here. It's completely in Spanish because this picture is taken on open source documentation that the railway company in Spain have completely publicly available on the internet. So this is a screenshot of their documentation. And this is what the train driver sees. As you can see, this little blue dashboard has some buttons that represents the acknowledgement of the train driver that they have received this signal or the advice of these signals. So they push, I have acknowledged this signal, and I have to keep moving forward. And we get into what we call the dark territory because there has been several serious accidents in Spain related to the control of the signals. The first one is the Huarte Araquil. It was like 30 years ago, and it was related to not having any kind of beacons or signals or systems of control on the railway. And the train driver saw a signal, but misconfused the signal and misinterpreted what he saw, and lots of people died. And then, like 10 years ago, when was the Galician accident? It was 10 years ago, right? They had a huge accident in Spain too, where kind of lots of people died because there was a misconfiguration between other factors. There was a misconfiguration in the ASFA system, so it could be not completely avoidable, but less difficult to fix. So we have these beacons. These are the beacons that we have in the ASFA systems, and these beacons are sit on the railway, and you can receive it by the capture. So, go ahead.
So I have to work here. So we have the beacon in that the black box. The wood doesn't count. It's only the black box, and inside this black box is a coil and a capacitor. So we have a coil capacitor circuit in closed loop, no batteries, no voltage here, no batteries, no IC power. So it's a passive device that is powered by the train when the train passes along the track. So we have here a very simple circuit with a coil and capacitors in parallel. So I'm going to explain why there's where this setup makes sense. So the technology behind the ASFA system is based on induction, as you can find in your kitchen or in your phone charger, wireless, of course. and even in RFID tags and so on. But it's a very primitive kind of RFID tag. Very primitive because there is no data transmit, but it's only an aspect transmit. So we're going to see that. All of this is publicly available if you Google that. So a guy put this on internet that, oh, I have to repair an ASFA tester. An ASFA tester is a device that it will be on the train part. So this device, you put this device above the beacon, and this device read what kind of beacon is. So we have two coils here. The two rounds, the two circles are two coils. One coil is for transmit, to give power to the beacon, and the other one is to receive power. So if you, what about if you use a circuit with a coil and capacitor to emulate a beacon? We could replicate a beacon, and we could make a fake beacon. So we require wire and a capacitor. That's all. It's enough for that. So this is I think this is the most important slide here in this talk, because it represents very well how the setup is configured. So we have the beacon itself in the track, and the beacon is, as you can see in the diagram, we have a coil and a capacitor. We represented a variable capacitor because you can configure it, you can change the capacitance of the circuit to change the aspect. For example, if I want to transmit a red light, we change the capacitance. This beacon is by default in red signal. Is the safest symbol that is red light, obviously. So if we put a smart current temporarily to that symbol, we can change the aspect. So we only need power only to change from red to another symbol, for example, green or yellow. And the other setup here is in the train part. So we have a capture that it has two items. We have a 111 kilohertz generator, AC power. So we can generate a frequency of that kind with also a coil and a capacitor. And at the same time, the train has put together another device that receives that power by inductance coupling. Oh, I seen 111 kilohertz. That's okay. It's working. Okay, but when the train passes.
When the train passes through.
When the train passes through the beacon, an inductive coupling is produced between the first coil that it transmits at 111 kilohertz, the second coil that receives that signal, and the third coil that is on the tracks that modify the inductance coupling to another frequency, to the frequency that is configured that beacon. It's easy to understand, yes?
Yes, of course.
Okay? It's okay.
Easy.
So, that's our desk. And we have the transmitter part. Firstly, to make the fake beacon, we need the framework, like Java, JavaScript, and so on. So Visual Studio Code. So this is our code editor. So we need a framework to test the beacon at that point that was not existing. So firstly, we need a transmitter. So we set up a coil and a capacitor that is suitable to transmit power at 111 kilohertz. Okay? We use an AliExpress device called NanoVNA that is a vector network analyzer that you can buy. It's cheap. So you can see the impedance, the inductance, the resonance, and so on. So this is the receiver part. Is more or less the same setup, but instead of transmitting power, it receives power. So it's fine-tuned to capture frequencies from 50 kilohertz to 111. So it's very wide range to capture all the aspects of any beacon. So we have a signal generator, also from AliExpress, and yeah, and we receive that signal on the receiver part. So we already have the tester. So we need to make the beacon itself.
So what if two people here or not here could replicate this beacon and show it to you right now? Show it? So I pay you for that.
Okay, me toca a mí. ¿El tester?
¿Ah? No, la valí.
Ah, pero vamos a hacer el tester.
Well, the most important part of this tester we did is a can of morteluelo de Cuenca, which is, yeah. They are laughing because morteruelo de Cuenca means meat in a can, okay? So it's what helped us to have like this coil or setup, and it works perfectly. So meat in a can may be a key factor in this tester, okay? And the second part is the beacon. Okay, so we could replicate the beacon by following the calculus that you can do with data that is completely, I repeat, completely available on the internet in open source information. So this one is the L5 as you saw. One second. Here, this one is the L5, the yellow sign. And for legal reasons, we cannot show you here on this stage the proof that this works, but outside of the stage, anyone that comes and asks will have the answer, okay? We don't want to go to jail, but we like to brag about our thing. Yeah, okay. Todavía te queda explicar esto.
Hacking. So, as a computer engineer, I have to make the work of the electronic engineer here. So, if any electronic engineer here can come to explain that, and we rest here.
So, if there is any electronic engineer in the house, is there any electronic engineer here? Just raise your hand. Okay, we are sorry in advance.
So when you put current in inductor and capacitive circuit, it's like a magic, you know. It's magic. Indeed, it's black magic here, because when you put a set of frequencies, so the circuit behaves differently accordingly to the frequency that you put in that circuit. The computing engineers here, we couldn't understand this, like the circuit has behaves as a capacitive, as a virtual capacitor, as a virtual resistance, or as a virtual inductor. It's okay, eh? That's cool. You don't get rid of virtual devices even if you are an electronic engineer. So the point here is to design a circuit that resonates at a very specific and very narrow set of frequencies. Indeed, you need to resonate very narrow interval of frequencies. So, as you see, as Gabs explained to you, we need a circuit that resonates at a certain frequencies to make the train think that this is a symbol. It's a real symbol, a red light, a green light, a yellow, even a yellow and green light that exists. It's Trainiac stuff, don't worry. So we need that, but how do you do that? We are computer engineers. So we need to wire by public photos and seeing the device in real world. We can get the dimensions of the beacon. We can guess that because there is a public documentation, but they don't give you the exact details to make the beacon, obviously. So you have to guess that at some point. So guessing the dimensions of the beacon and the shape, indeed, we started to wire 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, all day long. So we ask ourselves that, what I'm doing with my life? I could be in the swimming pool. So we end with a lot of turns, and what happens now? So we tested with the nano VNA, and nothing works. The resonance of the circuit is very far from the target resonance. So we cut the wire, and we put on the nano VNA. So we start to wire another round of turns, and we saw real time how this graph moves in real time, getting closer and closer and closer to the target frequency of or the desired symbol. So turning and turning and messing it up, and what the fuck? So we achieve one symbol. So indeed, this is not a real coil capacitor setup, but it's a double inductor setup. There are 2 inductors put it together and taking advantage of the parasitic capacitance. We have a virtual NC circuit that makes the same work at the real device. We know that the real device is 1 coil and 1 capacitor, but this stuff is 2 coils put it together and taking advantage of the parasitic capacitance. So this is the center frequency, and less frequency, the circuit behaves as a capacitor. The more frequency is the circuit behaving as induction. So at the very exact point, the circuit is a resistance. So this is the graph that you have to see to make sure you are doing right. In order to achieve the correct resonance frequency. The yellow line is the resonance that it has to be just in the middle of the graph. The green line is the impedance, so it has to be as low as possible at the resonance point. And the other one is the standing wave ratio. That is how well is the energy transferred from the system to outside and backwards. So that is the device. It's very, as you can see, it's very complex, very expensive. No.
And beautiful.
And beautiful, because it has, I think, this Amazon cardboard.
Thank you, Amazon.
Thank you, Amazon.
And AliExpress.
What you have to use isolated copper wire. So if you can, once we have this item, we have to put glue on the device. That is very important because you make with the fingers any movement and the frequency changes. It's crazy. It's crazy. You take the device and no more works. No. So you have to glue of the wire to make sure that the center frequency remains at the target frequency.
In the tester, the most important was the can, and here the glue.
The most important thing in the tester is the can of mortadelo of meat, and here is the glue, the key component.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm seeing the electronical engineering looking at us. Sorry, really. I have stickers for you to compensate this.
So, how do you know that this works? Well, firstly, you have to know what to see. It's a key factor. You have to know that I have to see things. So, in the picture of the left, we have the default frequency being received by the receiver device. So we transmit 111 kilohertz. And okay, I'm working. I'm receiving the same frequency as the train transmits. That's a permanent testing that the system works. So the left one, the right one is when you pass through a beacon. So you see another spike on the spectrum analyzer. You have another spike that represents the resonant frequency of the device, of the beacon. So that works. Thank you with this sincere applause. So, where should I place my fake beacon? Well, the official documentation already tells you where to put your device, your fake device. So that's the dimension. You have to keep a distance from the rails and a certain height from the sleeper. So from the sleepers? Sleepers, traviesas, sleepers. So the most important thing that it matches the position perfectly to make all the setup take place, the induction coupling. This is not an radio frequency stuff, but it's more inductive coupling. We firstly thought that it was a radio frequency problem, but it's more like an inductive coupling, as Gabriela says to you. So, what about another systems all over Europe and worldwide? Well, in UK, you have the AWS system.
Not powered by Amazon.
Not powered by Amazon. This is, indeed, the Spanish system is the most sophisticated legacy system, but, because they have more symbols to transmit. The UK system only has 2 symbols, go and stop, that's all. So you see a star in the cabin.
It's called the sunflower.
Sunflower, and it's okay, not okay, that's all. And this is the industry. In German is very
yeah. It has a name in German that we don't know how to spell. Okay, so let's call it Indusi and let's have some fun.
We don't have to offend German people. So there is also that kind of systems that it's based on the same principle. So, but they are not one-to-one compatible. So you will have to make your own device adjusted to that kind of setups. And that is the North American system that also is based on the same principle, but they are not entirely widespread on all the tracks. It's intermittent. It's an intermittent system. But it's based, again, in the same principle by induction. What about new things? Well, that's, we talk about a legacy system that was invented on the middle of the 20th century. So what about new system? We're talking about new because it was invented in the 90s. Okay, cool. Well, we have the ATCS, the European Trade Control System, that is based again on beacons, but they transmit digital data. So we will talk about this next year, maybe. So the main thing here is that all the European region has a very different systems, and they thought, what about a new protocol? So we have a new protocol that covers all Europe, but it is not implemented already widespread. Only in high-speed trains and very crowded lines, because it takes money, you know. So it combines beacons called Eurobalis. I like more beacons. And they combine that system with some kind of mobile communications, changing the protocol. It's called JCM Air. Air means railroad.
Okay. So as you have seen in the whole presentation, what we have discovered is that by inductive coupling, we can reach the most of the signaling system in Spain, because they don't use this system, ETCS, in the most of the railway segments. So what we have is now security problems that was in their time a really robust protocol, because these kinds of protocols are not being properly revised. So one of the main things that we receive when we talk about this investigation is why we are talking about this. And the reason is that we want to revise, or we want companies to revise this kind of systems. For example, we can adopt this new ETCS system. This system started being quite less robust, but now it's like in level 3, developing level 3, and having very good results in terms of security. But it costs money, and money is a key factor in the decision making of the politicians and authorities related to this. So one of the other measures that we can offer, and we are completely willing to work with authorities in that, is the usage, for example, of trained drones that are being developed. This one is AI generated, okay? Because I didn't find the picture. Italy have now quite bigger but yet tiny trained drones, and these trained drones can be deployed through the whole railway segments to investigate or inspect the beacons, just to know if there is any weird objects, for example, in the railway, or anyone has covered these beacons. Because the beacons, these kind of beacons, ASFA beacons, can be just shut down by putting above them a plate, a slice of plomo? Lead. Okay, so we are trying to make quite a concern and talk with our authorities to make them inspect them. Another object they can use are normal drones, just surveillance and looking at these railway segments, just to, again, know if there is any strange objects in the railway segments. And of course, we can use testers and pass testers more frequently, just to know everything is okay with the beacons. Actually, we don't have to create this chaos or fear, just want to have more intensity in the inspection rounds to change these devices into more newer devices around the world, because this investigation is based on the most robust legacy system, that is the ASFA, but here Amtrak is using it, UK is using it, not the same but less robust systems, and of course Germany, Austria, Hungary. So we can work to change this, or at least to revise this, to keep everyone safe around the world. So thanks everyone that helped us to get here. And of course, we are here for the questions. Yes? Yes?
Right. Thanks for the talk. Very educational, funny, and scary, honestly. When you have a signal that can display multiple aspects, how does that relate to the meat cans that are set on the track? Does it change its own resonance to reflect the current aspect on the signal?
Yeah, actually they do. Because what differentiates one signal through the other is the state they leave the capacitor circuit in the train. So in the difference between these frequencies is the aspect the operator receives inside the train. Okay.
Okay. What are the related risks or threats related with this finding that you get? Mostly beyond that, to prevent accidentality in the trains. What are the risks?
The risks? Well, actually, we started this investigation because in Spain we are in terrorist alert 4 from 5. So it's quite important because the biggest accidents that have happened in Spain had happened with trains. Actually, we have a real difficult incident that happened the 11th of March that marked before and after on the way of that people sees the railway and the metro in Spain. So any people with the right amount of motivation and knowledge could exploit this. So we want to make a call, a wake-up call before something like this happens, and make people to invest more time and money into keep the safety around Spain and of course around the world, because this can happen like mostly everywhere.
So thanks, this is really fascinating. I'm curious to know if there are any other systems that the drivers rely on to make their decisions about how to, what speed to control the trains. Is it primarily these beacons that they're using for that? Or is there any other input they're also using to make the judgment?
Sorry, I didn't hear you anything,
sure.
sorry.
Is there another system?
Well, the train driver has the real signals, and the system is an acknowledged system to make sure that the train driver has seen the right signal. So by default, there is no other resource, and the point here is that you could make a red signal device in the middle of the track with no lights, for example.
Thank you.
Any other questions? More questions?
More questions?
No? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And so I just wanted to say, on behalf of the C&E Goon team, DEF CON, thank you, content creators. We have nothing without you, and you surprise us every year. Same with the humans. All right, the countdown's hitting, so they're going to play me off soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the clicker. That's theirs.